They always think silence means surrender, that a queen who stops screaming has given up. But Queen Celine Ashford learned something in 15 years of standing beside a man who never truly saw her. Sometimes the most dangerous move is the one nobody hears coming. Tonight, while champagne glasses clinked and nobles laughed at jokes she'd written for her husband's speeches, Celine would begin dismantling an empire brick by silent brick. Stay until the end to see how a woman they called broken becomes the knife they never saw. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my tribe is watching this unfold. The crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across the grand hall, like shattered promises. Celine stood at the edge of the anniversary banquet, her burgundy gown clinging to her shoulders in a way that felt more like armor than silk. 15 years. 15 goddamn years she'd spent turning a reckless boy king into something resembling a ruler, and now 300 nobles pretended not to stare at her while whispering behind jeweled fans. She could taste the pity in the air. It had a specific flavor, sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. Cedric sat at the head table, his crown slightly crooked the way it always was when he'd been drinking since noon. Lady Vivienne Mercer perched beside him in a chair that hadn't existed at last year's banquet. Celine had noticed. She noticed everything. Vivienne wore emerald silk that cost more than most farming villages earned in a season. Her laugh carried across the hall, high and crystalline and deliberately loud enough to echo. Every time Cedric leaned toward her, every time his hand disappeared beneath the table, Celine felt the eyes of the court swing back to her face, waiting for the crack in her composure. They'd be waiting a long time. Lord Marshal Theron approached with a wine goblet in each hand, his military medals clinking softly against his chest. He'd served under Celine's father before the old king died. He was one of the few men in this room who still looked her in the eye. "Here, Your Majesty," he said quietly, offering her a goblet. "The Valerian red you prefer." She took it, but didn't drink. "Thank you, Theron. Tell me, how many officers attended tonight?" His weathered face tightened. "Fewer than last year. The new appointments requested leave." "The new appointments," Celine repeated softly. She watched Cedric throw his head back, laughing at something Vivienne whispered. "You mean the boys she recommended? The ones who've never seen a battlefield, but somehow outrank men who've bled for this kingdom." Theron's jaw worked. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." A servant passed carrying a silver tray of roasted quail. The smell turned Celine's stomach. She hadn't eaten since dawn. Eating required letting her guard down, and she couldn't afford that luxury anymore. Not since she'd found the treasury ledgers 3 weeks ago, hidden in a locked drawer in Cedric's private study. Not since she'd seen her own signature forged on transfer orders she'd never signed. Not since she'd realized that while she'd been governing the kingdom, her husband had been selling it piece by piece to a woman who collected power the way other people collected jewels. The musicians struck up a waltz. Couples flooded the dance floor in a swirl of silk and superficial grace. Cedric stood, extending his hand to Vivienne. The gesture was performative, a middle finger wrapped in velvet gloves. "Your Majesty," a voice said behind her. Celine turned. Count Aldrich Brennan stood there, his round face flushed with wine and something that might have been shame. He'd been Cedric's childhood friend, back when loyalty still meant something. "Aldrich," she said evenly. He shifted his weight, the floorboards creaking beneath his expensive boots. "I wanted to say that as many of us feel, that I should accept my husband's very public humiliation with grace and dignity." He flinched. "I was going to say that the court remembers everything you've done for this kingdom, the trade agreements with the eastern provinces, the famine relief programs, the way you negotiated peace with the Northlands when Cedric wanted to invade." Past tense, she observed. "You said done, as if my work is finished." Aldrich's mouth opened and closed. "Isn't it?" Celine let the question hang between them like a noose. Then she smiled. The same smile she'd perfected over 15 years of swallowing rage at diplomatic dinners. "That depends entirely on what you think my work was, Aldrich. Did you think I spent 15 years turning Cedric into a competent king? Or did you think I spent 15 years learning exactly how this kingdom operates so thoroughly that I could dismantle or rebuild it in my sleep?" The blood drained from his face. "Excuse me," she said pleasantly, and walked away before he could respond. She moved through the crowd like a knife through water, smooth, silent, leaving no ripples. Nobles nodded as she passed. Some even smiled. But nobody met her eyes for long. They were afraid, she realized, not of Cedric's anger or Vivienne's influence. They were afraid of what Celine might become now that she had nothing left to lose. Good. Fear was more useful than love. Her father had taught her that before lung fever took him when she was 19. The banquet hall opened onto a moonlit terrace. Celine stepped outside, letting the cool night air fill her lungs. Below the palace walls, the capital city spread out in layers of lamplight and shadow. 100,000 souls who had no idea their kingdom was being gutted from the inside. She pulled the royal signet ring from her finger. The gold was warm from her skin. The Ashford crest, a phoenix rising from ash, caught the moonlight. Her father had placed this ring on her hand the day she married Cedric. She'd been 20 years old and stupid enough to believe in fairy tales where kings and queens ruled together in partnership and mutual respect. 15 years of wearing this ring. 15 years of signing decrees and trade agreements and execution orders with this symbol of authority pressed into red wax. And now it meant nothing. Cedric had stripped her power so quietly she hadn't noticed until the architecture of her authority was already rubble. She turned the ring over in her palm. The inscription inside was too worn to read, but she'd memorized it years ago. Power serves those who never stop moving. Footsteps echoed on the terrace stones. Running away from your own party? Vivienne's voice dripped with amusement. How very undignified. Celine didn't turn around. She slipped the ring into the hidden pocket of her gown, the one she'd sewn herself because even queens needed secrets. I needed air. The hall was suffocating. Vivienne moved to stand beside her at the balcony railing. Up close, she was younger than Celine had realized. 25, maybe 26. Her skin still had that unlined quality that comes from never having worried about anything more serious than which gown to wear. She smelled like jasmine and ambition. You know, Vivienne said conversationally, I actually admire you. Celine finally looked at her. Do you? It was a statement, not a question, but Vivienne answered anyway. Absolutely. 15 years of playing the perfect queen, never complaining, never causing a scene. It must have been exhausting, pretending to be something you're not. And what do you think I am? Vivienne's smile was razor sharp, obsolete. The word landed like a slap. Celine absorbed it, turning it over in her mind the way she'd turned over the ring. Obsolete. A relic. Yesterday's queen standing beside tomorrow's power. You've taken my husband, Celine said quietly. My title and everything but name, my influence at court. Tell me, what else are you planning to steal? Vivienne laughed, that crystalline sound that made Celine's teeth ache. Steal? Oh, darling, you can't steal what was never really yours. Cedric's affection, the court's respect, the kingdom's future. You were keeping all of it warm for someone who actually knows what to do with power. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. I'm not stealing anything. I'm simply taking what I've earned. And what have you earned exactly? Celine kept her voice level, conversational. Opening your legs at opportune moments? For a heartbeat, Vivienne's mask slipped. Rage flashed across her perfect features, raw and ugly and real. Then she recovered, smoothing her expression back into amused condescension. At least I know how to make a man feel like a king. You turned Cedric into a figurehead and yourself into his handler. Men don't fall in love with their handlers, Your Majesty. They resent them. Celine absorbed this too. There was truth in it, bitter as medicine. She'd spent so many years managing Cedric's impulses, cleaning up his mistakes, speaking for him in council meetings when he stumbled over policy details he'd never bothered to learn. She'd convinced herself it was partnership. But looking back now with clear eyes, she saw what it really was. A mother raising a child who would never grow up. You're right, Celine said softly. I did make mistakes. Vivienne's eyebrows rose, surprised by the admission. I treated him like a partner instead of the weapon he actually is, Celine continued. I trusted him to have honor he never possessed. I built a kingdom on a foundation that turned out to be quicksand. She turned to face Vivienne fully. But here's what you don't understand about mistakes. They're only permanent if you refuse to correct them. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Celine said, that while you've been playing dress-up in my husband's bed, I've been learning exactly how fragile your new empire really is. Every general you think you've bought, every noble whose loyalty you believe you've secured, Every secret agreement you made with merchants and magistrates. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. I wrote the manual on how this court operates, Vivian. You're just reading from my old notes. Vivian's confidence wavered for a fraction of a second. Then she recovered, lifting her chin. Empty threats from a woman everyone's already forgotten. Perhaps, Celine said. I suppose we'll see. She walked back into the banquet hall before Vivian could respond, her heart hammering against her ribs. That was reckless, stupid, a crack in the facade she couldn't afford to show, but God, it had felt good to stop swallowing poison and spit some back. The crowd had thinned. It was late, well past midnight. Cedric had disappeared, probably to his chambers with Vivian following soon after. The servants were beginning to clear tables, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned to be invisible. Celine found Theron near the wine service, his weathered face creased with concern. Walk with me, she said quietly. They moved through the palace corridors without speaking until they reached the east wing, the old section where her father's study still sat unused, gathering dust and memories. She unlocked the door with a key she'd carried for 15 years and ushered Theron inside. The room smelled like old leather and older grief. Her father's map still covered the walls, the kingdom as it had been, before Cedric's incompetence had started carving pieces away. Before trade routes dried up and border villages went undefended. Before corruption became policy. Celine lit the oil lamp on the desk, casting dancing shadows across the floor. What's this about? Theron asked carefully. She pulled a leather document case from behind a row of books, hidden so well that even the cleaning staff had never found it. Inside were papers she'd been collecting for 3 months, treasury records with forged signatures, secret military appointments that violated protocol, letters between Vivian and several nobles promising titles and land in exchange for their support. Evidence of embezzlement. Evidence of treason. This, Celine said, is everything they don't know I have. Theron flipped through the documents, his expression darkening with each page. Jesus Christ, this is enough to bring down half the court. Half the court, Celine agreed, including my husband. He looked up sharply. What are you planning? Celine leaned against her father's old desk, feeling the weight of 15 years pressing down on her shoulders. I'm planning to do what I should have done the day I discovered Cedric was more interested in playing king than being one. She met Theron's eyes. I'm taking back everything they stole from me, the power, the authority, the kingdom. And I'm going to do it so quietly they won't realize it's happening until it's already done. That's treason, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it treason to save a kingdom from the man destroying it? Is it treason to stop a corrupt king and his puppet master from selling crown lands to foreign merchants? Is it treason to protect the people nobody else gives a damn about? She pushed away from the desk. My father taught me that a ruler's first duty is to the kingdom, not to themselves. Cedric has forgotten that lesson. Someone needs to remind him. Theron studied her for a long moment. And if you fail? If this gets exposed before you're ready? Then I'll die, Celine said simply. Cedric will have me executed for conspiracy, and Vivian will throw a party to celebrate. But if I do nothing, I'll watch this kingdom crumble into dust while everyone pretends not to notice. She picked up one of her father's old maps, running her fingers over the borders he'd defended. I'd rather die trying to save something than live watching it burn. Theron was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. What do you need? First, I need to know which generals still remember their oaths. The ones sworn to the kingdom, not to Cedric personally. There are 7 who fit that description. Maybe 8 if we're generous. Contact them. Quietly. Don't mention my name yet. Just ask hypothetical questions about where their loyalties would fall if the crown became compromised. He nodded. What else? The merchant guilds. They're bleeding money under Cedric's new tariff system. I need to know if they'd support a restructuring of trade policy. You mean if they'd support you? Celine smiled faintly. I mean if they'd support their own survival. Cedric's driving them into bankruptcy to fund Vivian's expensive tastes. Business owners tend to get practical when their livelihoods are threatened. I'll make inquiries. And Theron? She caught his arm as he turned to leave. This stays between us. Not your wife. Not your closest friend. Nobody. The moment word spreads that I'm moving against the king, I'm dead. Understood, Your Majesty. Don't call me that, she said quietly. Not until I've earned it back. After he left, Celine stood alone in her father's study, surrounded by maps of a kingdom that was supposed to be hers to protect. The oil lamp flickered, throwing strange shadows across the walls. She felt exhausted down to her bones. 15 years of exhaustion she'd been holding back through sheer stubborn will. But beneath the exhaustion was something else. Something bright and sharp and dangerous. Purpose. For 15 years she'd defined herself by her relationship to Cedric, the supportive wife, the patient advisor, the woman behind the throne. She'd poured everything she was into making him successful, and he'd repaid her by trading her influence for a younger woman's attention. But standing here now, holding evidence of his corruption in her hands, Celine realized something that made her want to laugh and scream simultaneously. She'd never needed Cedric at all. Every treaty she'd negotiated, every crisis she'd diffused, every policy reform that had actually improved people's lives, those had been her victories, not his. Cedric had just been the face on the coin while she did the real work of governance. And if she could build a kingdom with dead weight tied around her neck, imagine what she could do unchained. The thought was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. She locked the documents back in their hiding place and extinguished the lamp. The palace was silent now, everyone asleep or pretending to be. Celine walked through the dark corridors toward her chambers, the rooms she still technically shared with Cedric, though he hadn't slept there in months. Her lady's maid, Iris, waited inside, already preparing the bed for a night Celine knew she wouldn't sleep through. Iris was 60 years old and had served Celine's mother before the old queen died in childbirth. She had a face like weathered stone and loyalty that ran bone deep. "You should have slapped that little bitch across the terrace," Iris said without preamble. Celine smiled despite herself. "Witnesses," she said. "Too many witnesses." "Witnesses be damned. She disrespected you in your own palace at your own anniversary celebration. There are peasant women with more dignity than that creature." Celine sat at her vanity, letting Iris unpin the elaborate braids that had taken 2 hours to construct that afternoon. Dignity is overrated. Results matter more. In the mirror, she watched Iris's reflection. The old woman's hands were steady as she worked, but her mouth was pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "I know that look," Celine said. "You want to tell me something?" Iris was quiet for a moment, working through a particularly stubborn pin. "When I served your mother," she said finally, "there was a minor lord who tried to undermine her authority, spread rumors, formed alliances against her. She tolerated it for a while, thinking patience would win out. What happened? Your mother had him exiled, stripped him of his lands and titles, and sent him away with nothing but the clothes on his back." Iris met Celine's eyes in the mirror. She told me later that her only regret was waiting so long to act. "Mercy toward those who want to destroy you isn't virtue, girl. It's suicide." Celine absorbed this. She'd heard stories about her mother, brief fragments that her father would share on late nights when the wine made him nostalgic. A woman who'd ruled alongside him with iron in her spine and fire in her blood. A woman who'd died before Celine was old enough to remember her face. "I'm not planning to be merciful," she said quietly. "Good," Iris replied, pulling the last pin free. Celine's hair cascaded down her back in dark waves. "Because that man you married doesn't deserve your mercy, and that girl he's fucking doesn't deserve your restraint." The bluntness of it startled a laugh out of Celine. "Christ, Iris, tell me how you really feel. I feel like I've watched you sacrifice 15 years to a man who never appreciated it. And I'm tired of biting my tongue while he parades his mistress around like she's already queen." The old woman's hands came to rest on Celine's shoulders. "Your mother would have burned this palace down before letting herself be disrespected like this. Maybe it's time you remembered whose daughter you are." Celine stared at her reflection, 35 years old, still beautiful in the way that came from good bones rather than youth, but tired. God, so tired. The dark circles under her eyes told the story of too many sleepless nights. The fine lines at the corners of her mouth spoke to too many forced smiles. But beneath the exhaustion, she saw something else. Something her father must have seen. Something that had made him believe she could survive being married to a man like Cedric. She saw her mother's eyes staring back at her, iron and fire. "Go to bed, Iris," she said softly. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." After the old woman left, Celine sat at her vanity for a long time, studying her reflection by candlelight. Somewhere in this palace, Cedric was probably asleep beside Vivienne, believing he'd won, believing he'd finally freed himself from the wife who'd controlled him for 15 years. He had no idea that the woman he'd discarded was the only thing that had been holding his kingdom together. But he was going to learn. She pulled out the royal signet ring from her pocket and placed it on the vanity. In the candlelight, the phoenix crest seemed to move, wings spreading, preparing for flight. Power serves those who never stop moving, her father's inscription read. Celine stood, blew out the candle, and walked to the window. Below, the capital slept in darkness. 100,000 people who had no idea their queen had just declared a war nobody else knew was starting. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, feeling the night air seep through. This kingdom thought she was broken. They were about to discover what a broken woman could build from the rubble of her shattered illusions. And somewhere in the darkness, the first dominoes were already beginning to fall. 3 days later, the royal treasury reported its first unexplained shortage. 5,000 gold crowns simply gone, vanished from locked vaults that only 3 people had keys to access. Cedric ordered an investigation. He never thought to ask his wife if she knew anything about it. That was his second mistake. His first had been thinking Celine would cry when he replaced her. The treasury shortage became a hemorrhage within a week. 8,000 gold crowns. Then 12. Then amounts so large the royal accountant stopped sleeping and started drinking before noon. Cedric called an emergency council meeting on a gray morning when fog hung over the palace like dirty wool. Celine arrived exactly on time, wearing midnight blue silk that made her look like a blade wrapped in shadows. She took her seat at the far end of the table, the seat they'd moved her to 3 months ago when Vivienne started attending council sessions. The king looked like hell, purple shadows under his eyes. His crown sitting crooked because he'd probably thrown it on without checking a mirror. He drummed his fingers on the table, a nervous habit he'd never broken despite 15 years of her trying to train it out of him. Vivienne sat at his right hand wearing cream and gold like she was already queen. Her smile was bright and empty as a doll's face. 16,000 crowns, Cedric announced without preamble. Gone. Vanished from vaults that are supposed to be impenetrable. He glared around the table at the assembled ministers and nobles. Someone in this room knows something. Silence. The kind that feels like pressure building before a storm. Lord Treasurer Harwick cleared his throat. He was 70 years old and had served 3 kings before Cedric. His hands shook slightly as he shuffled papers. Your Majesty, I've conducted a full audit. The gold didn't just disappear. Someone with authorization moved it. Someone with access to the royal seals. Are you accusing me of stealing from my own treasury? Cedric's voice climbed an octave. Of course not, sire. But the seals used were legitimate, not forgeries. That limits the suspect pool considerably. Every eye in the room swiveled towards Celine. She felt the weight of their suspicion like physical touch. She kept her face blank, bored even, and examined her fingernails as if the conversation didn't concern her. Something you want to share with the council, Your Majesty? Vivienne's voice dripped false sweetness. You've been awfully quiet. Celine looked up slowly, meeting Vivienne's eyes across the table. I'm just wondering why I'm here. I was removed from Treasury oversight 2 months ago. Perhaps you should be questioning whoever replaced me. Vivienne's smile tightened. The Treasury operates under royal authority, meaning the king's authority. And yet the king's authority seems to have misplaced 16,000 crowns. Celine tilted her head. Perhaps that authority needs better bookkeeping. Careful, Cedric warned. You're speaking to your king. Am I? Because lately it's been difficult to tell who's actually running this kingdom. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Several ministers looked like they wanted to crawl under the table. Lord Marshal Theron, seated halfway down, kept his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes flickered towards Celine for just a moment. Cedric's face flushed red. You think you're clever. You think playing word games makes you powerful. But you're nothing without that crown you used to wear. Nothing without me. Celine let the words wash over her. There was a time when they would have cut deep, drawn blood. Now they just sounded pathetic, a child throwing a tantrum because his toy wasn't performing correctly. You're absolutely right, she said quietly. I am nothing without you. Just like this kingdom will be nothing when you finish selling it piece by piece to fund your distractions. She stood, the chair scraping back with a sound like a scream. "Excuse me, I have actual work to do." "Sit down," Cedric commanded. "I didn't dismiss you." Celine paused, turned, looked at him with eyes that held no warmth, no affection, nothing but cold assessment. "You dismissed me months ago, Cedric. You just forgot to make it official." She walked out before he could respond. Behind her, she heard Vivian's bright laugh trying to diffuse the tension, heard Cedric's voice rising in anger, heard the scrape of chairs as the council dissolved into chaos. Good. Let them panic. Let them realize that the woman they'd written off as broken still had teeth. In the corridor outside, Theron caught up with her. His boots echoed on marble floors that had been polished smooth by 3 centuries of footsteps. "That was reckless," he said under his breath. Celine kept walking. That was necessary. Cedric needed to understand, I'm not playing by his rules anymore. He could have you arrested for insubordination. He could try. She glanced sideways at the old soldier. "How many generals have you contacted?" "6 so far. 3 are firmly with you. 2 are undecided. 1 reported our conversation to the king's new security chancellor." Celine absorbed this without breaking stride. "Who reported?" "General Marcus. The one Vivian appointed last month. Of course. Young. Ambitious. Probably promised a duchy if he plays loyal dog." She turned down a side corridor away from the main halls where servants might overhear. "What about the merchant guilds?" Theron pulled a folded paper from inside his jacket. 12 guildmasters are willing to meet with you, privately. They're terrified of the new tariff structures. Vivian's bleeding them dry to fund her renovations to the East Wing. Celine took the paper, scanning the names. These were serious players, the men who controlled grain distribution, textile production, metalwork. The economic backbone of the kingdom. When do they want to meet? Tomorrow night. The old textile warehouse on Merchant's Row, after dark. Tell them I'll be there. And Theron? She met his eyes. Make sure nobody follows me. If Cedric gets wind of this meeting, those men are dead, and so am I. Understood. After he left, Celine stood alone in the empty corridor, feeling her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The moment she crossed from quietly gathering information to actively building a counterpower structure. There was no going back from here. If this failed, if she was discovered, Cedric would have her executed for treason, and Vivian would probably volunteer to tie the noose. But if she succeeded, she could dismantle everything they'd built on her stolen authority and take back what was rightfully hers. The thought sent electricity down her spine. Not excitement exactly. Something darker. Something that tasted like rage fermented into strategy. She found Iris in her private chambers, mending a torn hem on one of Celine's riding gowns. The old woman looked up as she entered, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "You look like you're about to start a war," Iris observed. Celine collapsed into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "I think I already did. I just forgot to tell anyone it started." "What happened?" She recounted the council meeting. Iris listened without interrupting, her weathered face growing darker with each detail. "He accused you in front of the entire court," the old woman said flatly when Selina finished. "That boy has less sense than the horse he rode in on. He's desperate. The treasury losses are making him look incompetent. He needs someone to blame, and he chose the woman who actually knows where the money went." Iris shook her head. "Men. I swear they get stupider every generation. Despite everything," Celine laughed. It felt good, like coughing up poison. "Do you remember my father's old network? The people he used to meet with before making major policy decisions?" "The Shadow Council," Iris said. "Before your mother died, she ran it. After she passed, your father kept it going. Information brokers, spies in foreign courts, merchants with ears in every port city." She paused. "Why?" "Because I need to know if any of them are still alive and still loyal. To your father's memory, maybe." "To you?" The old woman pursed her lips. "That's a harder question." "Find out," Celine said. "I'll pay whatever it takes. I need eyes and ears beyond these palace walls. Cedric thinks this kingdom is just the nobility and the court. He has no idea how many people out there remember what competent leadership looks like. And if I find them, if they're willing to help, then we're going to remind this kingdom who actually kept it running for the last 15 years. The next evening, Celine left the palace through a servant's entrance most nobles didn't know existed. She wore a hooded cloak that concealed her face and clothing plain enough to blend with the working-class crowds that filled the streets after dark. Two of Theron's most trusted men followed at a distance, close enough to intervene if trouble started, but far enough back to maintain the illusion she was alone. The city smelled different down here. Wood smoke and horse dung, and the yeasty aroma of bread baking for tomorrow's breakfast. Street vendors called out their wares in voices hoarse from a day of shouting. Children ran between carts, playing games that looked dangerous, and probably were. This was the kingdom Cedric never saw, the real one, where people worked until their backs bent and their hands cracked and their eyes went dead from exhaustion. These were the people Celine had been trying to protect for 15 years while Cedric played at being king. The textile warehouse loomed at the end of Merchant's Row like a sleeping giant. 3 stories of weathered wood and broken windows. The guild masters had chosen well. Abandoned buildings didn't have ears. Theron waited by a side door, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. Inside he murmured as she approached. How many? 11 showed. 1 got cold feet. Celine nodded and stepped through the door into darkness that smelled like old wool and rat droppings. A single lantern burned in the center of the cavernous space, throwing long shadows across empty floorboards. 11 men stood in a rough circle around the light. She recognized most of them, faces from trade negotiations, names from contracts she'd personally approved. "Gentlemen," she said, lowering her hood, "thank you for coming." Aldrich Howe spoke first. He ran the largest grain operation in the kingdom, controlled the flour that became bread in every mouth from the palace to the poorest village. He was 60 years old with hands like tree roots. "Your Majesty, we're taking a considerable risk meeting like this. If the king finds out—" "He won't," Celine interrupted, "because you're going to tell me what you need and I'm going to give it to you, and then we're all going to walk away from this meeting wealthier and more secure than when we arrived." The grain merchant's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "That's a bold promise. I don't make promises I can't keep." She moved into the circle of light, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "You're all bleeding money under the new tariff system. The merchant taxes have tripled in 8 months. Export fees are strangling your profit margins. Half of you are considering moving your operations to neighboring kingdoms where the business environment isn't actively hostile." Nervous glances ricocheted around the circle. "What's your point?" This came from Marcus Webb, who controlled the metalworks that produced everything from farming tools to weapons. "We already know we're fucked. Saying it out loud doesn't help. My point," Celine said, "is that the tariff system wasn't designed to generate revenue for the kingdom. It was designed to generate revenue for one specific person who has very expensive tastes and no understanding of economics." "Vivian Mercer," someone muttered. Celine didn't confirm or deny. "What I'm offering is a way out. A return to the old trade agreements, the ones that actually made sense for both the crown and the merchant class. And how exactly would that work?" Aldrich crossed his arms. "Last I checked, you're not in a position to change policy anymore." "Not officially," Celine agreed. "But the thing about policy is that it only matters if it's enforced, and enforcement requires the cooperation of people like you." She let the implication hang in the air. What if the new tariffs simply weren't collected? What if the merchants' guilds united and refused to pay? "That's rebellion," Marcus said flatly. "The crown would send soldiers. Would they?" Celine tilted her head. "How many soldiers do you think would be willing to arrest the men who provide their weapons, their grain, their clothing? How many generals would follow orders to destabilize the economic foundation of the entire kingdom just to protect one woman's vanity projects?" More silence. This one tasted different, like possibility instead of fear. "You're asking us to risk everything," Aldrich said slowly. "Our businesses, our families, our lives. I'm asking you to invest in a future where your businesses can actually thrive again, where your families aren't bled dry by taxes that serve no purpose except enriching a woman who views you all as resources to be extracted." She stepped closer to the grain merchant. "I know you, Aldrich. You're a practical man, a survivor. So look at the numbers and tell me honestly, how long can you sustain losses like this before you're bankrupt?" His jaw worked. "Another year, maybe less. And you, Marcus? How long before the metalworks shut down because you can't afford the export fees?" 6 months, the weapons manufacturer admitted. 8 if I lay off half my workers." Celine turned in a slow circle, looking at each face. Every single person in this room is drowning. You came here tonight because you're desperate for a lifeline. I'm offering you one. But it requires trust, it requires coordination, and it requires the courage to bet against a king who's already proven he doesn't understand the kingdom he inherited. What do you get out of this? This question came from a younger merchant Celine didn't recognize. Besides revenge against your husband, Celine met his eyes. I get a kingdom that functions. I get trade routes that operate efficiently. I get economic stability that benefits everyone instead of just the people in the palace. She paused. And yes, I get to watch the woman who tried to destroy me realize that power built on theft doesn't last very long. Several men smiled at that, grim smiles, the kind that came from too many nights lying awake calculating losses. We'd need guarantees, Aldrich said. Something in writing. No. Celine shook her head. Nothing in writing, nothing that can be traced back to this conversation. You have my word, and you have the fact that my survival depends on your success. If this fails, I'm dead. That's a pretty compelling incentive to keep my promises. And if we agree, what happens next? Next, you stop paying the new tariffs. All of you, simultaneously. When the crown demands payment, you claim economic hardship, you file appeals, you drag the process out through every bureaucratic channel available. She smiled. And while the crown is distracted trying to collect taxes from people who can't afford to pay them, I'll be working to remove the person who implemented the tariffs in the first place. You're planning to remove the king? Someone gasped. I'm planning to remove his bad advisors, Celine corrected smoothly, and restore competent governance. What happens to Cedric specifically isn't your concern. The merchants exchanged looks, whole conversations happening in the spaces between glances. Finally, Aldrich spoke. We'll need to discuss this among ourselves. Take a vote. Of course. Celine pulled her hood back up. You have 2 days. After that, the offer expires and you're on your own. She walked toward the door, Theron falling into step beside her. Your Majesty, Aldrich called. If we do this, if we trust you, and it goes wrong, then we all die together, Celine finished. But dying fighting back beats dying slowly from 1,000 cuts. Outside, the night air felt clean after the stale warehouse atmosphere. Celine's hands were shaking slightly. Adrenaline, fear, the intoxicating terror of having just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That went better than expected, Theron murmured. Or worse. We won't know until they vote. She started walking back toward the palace, keeping to side streets where the shadows ran thick. How many do you think will agree? All of them. The old soldier sounded certain. They're already dead men walking. You just offered them a way to die with meaning. Back at the palace, Celine shed her plain clothes and scrubbed the street smell from her skin. She put on a nightgown that cost more than most families earned in a month and sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection. She looked different, sharper somehow, like something inside her had crystallized from soft to hard. There was a time when this would have felt wrong, when conspiring against her husband would have seemed like betrayal instead of survival. But that version of herself had died the night she found the forged signatures in the treasury records. The night she realized the man she'd sacrificed 15 years for viewed her as an obstacle instead of a partner. The woman staring back from the mirror wasn't the queen she used to be. This woman had learned that loyalty without reciprocity was just slavery wearing a crown. A knock at the door. Celine tensed, then relaxed as Iris entered carrying a tea tray. You should be asleep, the old woman said. So should you. Can't sleep when I'm worrying about you doing stupid things like meeting with rebels in abandoned warehouses. They're not rebels, Celine corrected. They're businessmen protecting their interests. Same thing from where the king sits. Iris poured tea with hands that barely shook despite her age. I found 3 members of your father's old network. 2 are still alive and willing to talk. The 3rd died last winter. Which 2? Matthias, the information broker, and Elena she prefers to be called a consultant, but your father used to call her his spider. Celine remembered them, vaguely. Shadowy figures who would appear in her father's study late at night, speak in whispers, then vanish before morning. Can we trust them? Your father did. That's the best answer I can give you. Set up a meeting, somewhere private. I need to know what's happening in the kingdom that the palace isn't hearing about. Iris nodded. Anything else? Celine hesitated. Then, yes. I need you to find out everything you can about Vivienne Mercer's past, where she came from, who her family is, what she was doing before she caught Cedric's attention. Everyone has secrets, Iris. I need to know hers. The old woman's eyes gleamed. Now that's a task I can enjoy. She turned to leave, then paused. Your mother would be proud, you know, of what you're becoming. I'm becoming someone who conspires against her own husband. I don't think that's something to be proud of. Your mother would say you're becoming someone who refuses to die quietly when they try to bury you alive. Iris met her eyes. There's a difference between being broken and being cornered. Broken things stay down. Cornered things fight back. After she left, Celine sat in the darkness, drinking tea that had gone lukewarm, thinking about her mother. The woman she'd never known. The queen who'd ruled alongside her father with such strength that even 15 years after her death, people still spoke her name with reverence. Would her mother have tolerated a husband like Cedric? Would she have spent 15 years trying to mold him into something better? Or would she have cut her losses the first time he proved unworthy and seized power for herself? Celine suspected she knew the answer. The next 2 days crawled past like wounded animals. Cedric launched a full investigation into the treasury thefts, bringing in external auditors and threatening everyone from the cleaning staff to senior ministers. The palace felt like a trap waiting to spring. Everyone walked on edges, voices pitched low, eyes darting toward corners as if spies might be hiding in the shadows. Celine attended court functions with a serene expression that made people nervous. She smiled at the right moments, nodded politely during conversations, gave no indication that beneath the surface she was a storm system gathering strength. Vivienne, meanwhile, grew more openly hostile. She made snide comments about aging queens who'd outlived their usefulness. She laughed loudly at Cedric's crude jokes about women who couldn't keep their husbands satisfied. She wore gowns cut so low they bordered on obscene and jewels that weighed down her neck like chains made of captured light. She was performing dominance, marking territory, trying to provoke Celine into a public breakdown that would justify her complete removal from court. Celine gave her nothing, just those small, cold smiles that revealed no emotion except mild boredom. On the third day, Theron found her in the gardens where she'd taken to walking in the afternoons. The roses were dying now that autumn had settled in, their petals brown at the edges like paper burned slowly. They voted, he said without preamble. Unanimous, yes. All 11 guilds are refusing the new tariffs effective immediately. Celine felt something in her chest expand. Relief. Vindication. The first real victory in a war nobody else knew she was fighting. What was Cedric's response? He doesn't know yet. The refusals are just starting to reach the treasury offices. But by tomorrow, he'll understand that he's lost control of the merchant class. And Vivienne? Theron's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. I hear she's been screaming at servants all morning. Apparently someone miscalculated the construction costs for her new solarium. Because the funds dried up, Celine guessed. Because the funds never existed. You redistributed the treasury reserves before Vivienne could redirect them. So now all her renovation projects are stalled, and she looks incompetent to the king. Celine turned back to the dying roses, watching petals fall like drops of dried blood. This is just the beginning. Cedric will try to force the merchants to comply. He'll threaten arrests, maybe even military action. He'll fail, Theron said with certainty. 3 more generals have declared for you, quietly, behind closed doors. But they'll refuse orders to move against the merchant guilds. 6 generals total now? 6 confirmed. 2 more likely within the week. Celine did the math. The kingdom maintained 12 standing generals. If 8 declared for her, Cedric would be left with 4. Not enough to control the military. Not enough to enforce policy through threat of violence. Not enough to survive a coordinated uprising. She was winning. The realization sent ice water through her veins. This was real. This wasn't just gathering information or making contingency plans. She was actively dismantling her husband's authority, piece by piece, brick by brick, taking apart the structure of power that had been built on her stolen influence. And once she started, there was no stopping. No going back to the way things were. Cedric would never forgive this. Vivienne would demand her execution. She was committed now to seeing this through to the end, whatever that end looked like. Tonight, she told Theron, I meet with Matthias and Elena. Tomorrow, we start moving against Cedric's remaining support in the noble houses. The old soldier nodded. Just remember, you're not doing this for revenge. You're doing it to save the kingdom. Can it be both? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. I suppose it can. That night, Celine met her father's old spies in a private room at an inn that catered to travelers who valued discretion over luxury. Matthias was older than she remembered, 70 if he was a day, white hair pulled back in a tail, eyes sharp as broken glass. Elena looked ageless in the way some women did, her face a smooth mask that revealed nothing except calculation. They sat around a table scarred by decades of use. A single candle burned between them. You look like your mother, Elena said. She had the same expression when she was planning something dangerous. I don't remember my mother. No, but I do. And trust me when I say she'd recognize herself in you right now. Elena leaned back in her chair. Iris says you need information about what's really happening in the kingdom beyond palace walls. Matthias pulled out a leather journal, opening it to pages covered in cramped handwriting. The kingdom is starving, he said bluntly. Not literally, yet. But the grain stores are depleted. The new tariffs have driven food prices up 40% in 6 months. The northern provinces are experiencing crop failures that the court hasn't acknowledged. And the king's advisors, meaning Lady Mercer, have been selling strategic grain reserves to foreign buyers at premium prices. Celine felt her stomach drop. Why would she do that? Profit, Elena said. And because she doesn't understand that grain reserves exist to prevent famine during bad harvest years. She thinks in terms of quarterly profits, not long-term stability. How bad is it? Bad enough that farmers are starting to hoard instead of sell. Bad enough that riots are being suppressed in 3 major cities. Bad enough that if winter comes early, people are going to die. Matthias met her eyes. Your father would have released emergency stores months ago. Cedric doesn't even know the problem exists. Because Vivienne is hiding it from him, Celine guessed. Or because he's too distracted by his new playmate to ask the right questions, Elena countered. Either way, the result is the same. The kingdom is teetering toward disaster and the crown is acting like everything's fine. Celine processed this, her mind racing through implications. If people were already rioting, if food security was genuinely threatened, then Cedric's position was even more fragile than she'd realized. A hungry population didn't care about royal authority. They cared about survival. I need documentation, she said. Price records. Suppressed reports about the riots. Evidence of grain sales to foreign buyers. Everything you have. Elena produced a thick envelope from inside her coat. Already prepared. We figured you'd ask. What else? Matthias studied her face. You're planning something bigger than just exposing corruption. What is it? I'm planning to remove a cancer before it kills the patient, Celine said quietly. But I need to know. If it comes down to choosing between the king and the kingdom, where will the people's loyalty fall? The 2 spies exchanged glances. It already has, Elena said. The people stopped believing in Cedric the day he put that woman on display like she was already crowned. They're just waiting for someone to give them permission to say it out loud. And if that someone was me, then you'd better be prepared for what comes after, Matthias warned. Overthrowing a king is the easy part. The hard part is what you build from the rubble. Celine left the inn with the envelope tucked inside her cloak and a decision crystallizing in her mind like ice forming on water. She'd been thinking too small, too incremental, quietly building support, slowly eroding Cedric's authority. But the kingdom didn't have time for slow. People were suffering. The economic infrastructure was collapsing. Every day she delayed was another day the damage deepened. She needed to move faster. She needed to force Cedric's hand into a mistake so catastrophic that even his remaining supporters would abandon him. She needed to become the villain in his story so completely that when the truth came out, the reversal would shatter him. Back in her chambers, she found Iris waiting with news written on her face like blood. What happened? Celine demanded. The old woman's hands were shaking. I found Vivienne's secret, where she came from, who she really is. And? She's nobody. Farm girl from the western provinces who learned early that beauty could be traded for security. She worked her way up through minor nobles, collecting information, selling secrets, climbing the social ladder one bed at a time until she caught the king's attention. Iris paused. But that's not the interesting part. What's the interesting part? She's been reporting to someone, sending letters in code to an address in the neighboring kingdom. Matthias helped me intercept one. We broke the cipher. What did it say? That she's been feeding intelligence about military positions, treasury reserves, and court politics to Duke Kensington across the border. Iris's voice was flat. Vivienne isn't just a social climber. She's a spy. And she's been using Cedric to give our enemies everything they need to invade. The room tilted. Celine sat down hard, her mind struggling to process the enormity of this revelation. Treason. Real treason. Not political maneuvering or power grabs, actual espionage that put the entire kingdom at risk. Does anyone else know? Just us. And Matthias. We haven't told anyone because we wanted to bring it to you first. Celine looked at the envelope in her hands, evidence of economic crimes and suppressed riots and corruption. And now this. Evidence that the woman Cedric had chosen over her was actively betraying the kingdom to foreign powers. This changed everything. She could expose Vivienne right now. Bring the intercepted letters to the council. Watch her be arrested and executed for treason. It would be justice. It would be satisfying. It would destroy Cedric's credibility completely when everyone learned he'd been sleeping with an enemy agent. But it would also be a waste. Because if Celine played this correctly, she could use Vivienne's treason as the foundation for something much bigger than revenge. She could use it to take the throne. Iris, she said slowly, we're not telling anyone about this. Not yet. What? But if we expose Vivienne now, Cedric executes her and pretends he knew nothing about it. He plays the victim. He survives. Celine stood, pacing to the window where moonlight turned the gardens into silver shadows. But if we wait, if we let this play out until the moment of maximum damage, we can bring down everyone complicit in her schemes. We can prove that Cedric was either incompetent enough to not notice treason happening in his own bed, or complicit enough to be considered a co-conspirator. You're going to let a spy keep operating? Let her keep feeding information to our enemies? I'm going to feed her false information through channels she thinks are secure. I'm going to let her think she's winning right up until the moment I destroy her. Celine turned back to Iris. And when the kingdom sees proof that their king chose a traitor over his wife, when they realize that everything I've been fighting for was protecting them from people who wanted to see this kingdom burn, they'll crown you themselves, Iris finished, or they'll execute me for treason. Celine smiled without humor. Either way, this ends soon. The old woman studied her for a long moment. You're not the girl you were. No. I'm the woman I had to become to survive what they tried to do to me. And if Cedric dies in all this, if your plan requires his death, Celine met her eyes. Then I'll mourn the man I thought I married, and I'll sleep soundly knowing the kingdom is better off without him. The silence that followed tasted like smoke. Finally, Iris nodded. Your mother really would be proud. After the old woman left, Celine sat alone in darkness, holding evidence of crimes that could bring down a king. Her heart was beating too fast. Her hands felt cold despite the warm room. She was standing on the edge of a precipice she'd been approaching for months without realizing it. Below was either death or transformation. There was no middle ground anymore. No path back to the woman she'd been. That version of herself had tried to save a marriage that was already dead. Had tried to be loyal to a man who valued her less than his own ego. Had tried to believe that love and duty were enough to sustain a kingdom. But love without respect was just exploitation wearing softer words. And duty without reciprocity was just chains made from promises she'd been the only one keeping. Tomorrow, she would send Matthias to the generals with false intelligence designed to be intercepted by Vivienne's network. Information about fictional military movements that would draw enemy troops toward imaginary weaknesses. She would let Vivienne think she was winning. Let Cedric believe he'd successfully sidelined his inconvenient wife. And while they celebrated their hollow victories, Celine would finish building the architecture of their destruction. She pulled her father's signet ring from its hiding place, sliding it onto her finger. The metal was cold. The phoenix crest caught moonlight and seemed to move, wings spreading, ready for flight. Power serves those who never stop moving. Outside her window, the palace slept in darkness. Nobles dreaming of advancement, servants dreaming of survival, a king dreaming he was safe, and one queen who'd stopped dreaming entirely because nightmares had taught her to stay awake. Celine pressed her palm against the cold glass, feeling winter approaching on the wind. Soon, she thought, Very soon, this entire kingdom would understand what it meant to underestimate a woman they thought they'd already buried. The war was no longer silent. It was just waiting for the first scream. The false intelligence went out on a Tuesday morning when frost still clung to the palace windows like accusations written in ice. Celine had crafted it carefully over 3 days, fictional troop movements along the eastern border, invented weaknesses in fortifications that didn't exist, manufactured supply chain vulnerabilities that would tempt any military strategist looking for an opening. She'd given it to Matthias, who'd passed it through channels designed to look secure, but were actually sieves. Channels Vivian's spy network monitored. Channels that would carry Celine's lies straight to Duke Kensington across the border like poison wrapped in official seals. Now all she had to do was wait for Vivian to take the bait. Celine stood in her father's old study, watching dawn break over the capital through windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. The room still smelled like him, leather and pipe smoke, and the particular mustiness that came from too many books in too small a space. She'd been spending nights here, away from the chambers she technically still shared with Cedric, away from the constant surveillance of court eyes and servant gossip. This was her war room now, her sanctuary, the place where she could stop performing serenity and let the rage show on her face without witnesses. Maps covered the walls, the kingdom as it was, as it had been, as it could be. Red marks indicated cities where riots had been suppressed. Blue marks showed military installations. Black marks were noble houses whose loyalty remained undecided. The whole kingdom reduced to colored pins and strategic calculations. She was so focused on the map she didn't hear Theron enter until he spoke. "We have a problem." His voice carried a weight that made her spine straighten. She turned. The old soldier's face was gray, his jaw tight in a way that spoke of news he didn't want to deliver. "What happened?" "General Marcus, the one who reported our initial contact to the king. He's dead. Found in his chambers this morning. Throat cut. Made to look like a robbery, but nothing was taken." Celine felt ice water replace the blood in her veins. "Who did it?" "Unknown. But it's a message. Someone knows we've been building a network. Someone's trying to scare the other generals back into line." "Or trying to scare me," Celine said quietly. "How are the others responding?" Theron's expression darkened further. 2 have gone silent, won't respond to messages. 3 are requesting emergency leave from their posts. Only 1, General Aldwick, has explicitly reaffirmed his support. So we've lost them. For now. They're terrified. A general murdered in the palace sends a very specific message about what happens to people who choose the wrong side. Celine walked to the window, pressing her forehead against cold glass. She could see servants in the courtyard below, going about morning duties as if the kingdom wasn't tearing itself apart beneath a surface of forced normalcy. Did Marcus know anything about our plans? Only that we'd approached him. He reported the contact, but he didn't know details about the merchant rebellion or the false intelligence. Theron paused. But whoever killed him is sending a warning to anyone else who might be considering treason. The word hung in the air like smoke. Treason. That's what this was now. That's what she'd become. A traitor conspiring against her lawful king. The fact that her king was incompetent and his mistress was an actual spy didn't change the legal reality. If this failed, if she was caught before she could expose Vivian's betrayal, she would be executed. Probably publicly. Probably painfully. "Find out who ordered the killing," she said. "I need to know if this came from Cedric or Vivian." "Does it matter?" "Yes. Because if Cedric ordered it, he's more dangerous than I thought. If Vivian ordered it without his knowledge, it means she's moving independently, and we have 2 separate threats to manage instead of 1. I'll investigate." Theron moved toward the door, then paused. "Your Majesty, Celine, be careful. Whoever's behind this, they know you're a threat. They're not going to wait politely while you build your case." "I know." After he left, Celine stood alone in the dusty study, feeling the weight of miscalculation settling on her shoulders. She'd been so focused on the long game, gathering evidence, building support networks, positioning pieces for a coordinated strike, that she hadn't considered someone might simply start killing her allies before she was ready to move. Speed had just become more important than perfection. She needed to accelerate everything, force the confrontation before more people died, before the generals who'd secretly declared for her decided survival was more important than loyalty. But acceleration meant risk, meant moving before all the pieces were in position, meant accepting that this might fail spectacularly and take her down with it. The alternative was watching her supporters get murdered one by one until she stood alone against a king who'd already proven he valued her less than his own pride. Some choice. She was still standing at the window when Iris burst in without knocking, her weathered face flushed with exertion. "You need to see this," the old woman gasped. "Now." "What is it? Just come." Iris led her through servant corridors to a storage room that hadn't been used in years. Inside, Matthias waited beside a figure slumped in a chair, a young man Celine didn't recognize, his face bruised, his hands bound. "Who is this?" she demanded. "Tell her," Matthias ordered. The young man's eyes were wide with terror. He couldn't have been more than 20. "My name is Devin. I was a clerk in the Treasury office." "And?" Celine kept her voice hard. "I've been altering records. On Lady Vivianne's orders. Making it look like you authorized transfers that you never signed. Creating evidence of embezzlement that never happened." The floor seemed to tilt. Celine gripped the back of the chair to steady herself. Evidence. Vivianne was creating evidence against her, building a case for treason that would hold up in court because the documents would be real, even though the crimes were fabricated. "How long has this been going on?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. 3 months. Maybe longer. I'm not the only one. There are 4 of us, all taking orders from Lady Vivianne, all creating paper trails that point to you stealing from the treasury. The missing gold, Celine realized, the 16,000 crowns that had vanished from the vaults. That had been Vivianne setting the trap, making Cedric paranoid about treasury theft so that when fabricated evidence surfaced pointing to Celine, he'd already be primed to believe it. She'd walked right into it. Spent weeks quietly building her network while Vivianne built a gallows. "Where are the forged documents now?" Matthias asked. "In the Treasury Archive. Locked vault. Only 3 people have keys, the king, the treasurer, and Lady Vivianne. Can you get them?" Devin shook his head frantically. "I'm just a clerk. I don't have access to the vault. I only saw them once when Lady Vivianne was reviewing my work." Celine processed this, her mind racing through implications. If those documents reached the Royal Council, if Cedric saw evidence, fake evidence, that she'd been embezzling from the treasury for months, he would have legal justification for her arrest, for her execution. And everyone would believe it because the documents would be expertly forged, using her own signature style, her personal seals. "We need to destroy those records," Iris said, "before they can be used against you." "We can't," Celine said slowly. The pieces were clicking together in her mind like a lock turning. "If we destroy them, Vivianne knows we're onto her scheme. She'll just create new evidence. We need to expose the forgeries as forgeries, prove they're fake in a way that discredits everyone involved in creating them." "How?" Matthias demanded. "You'd need the original transfer authorizations to prove these are altered. You'd need testimony from the forgers. You'd need—" "I need Vivianne to present the evidence herself," Celine interrupted, "in front of the full court, with witnesses." She looked at Devin. "How close are the forgeries to completion?" "She's planning to present them to the king in 3 days." At the emergency council session, he called to address the merchant rebellions. 3 days. Not enough time to build a complete counter case. Not enough time to gather all the proof she needed to expose Vivianne as a spy. But maybe, enough time to set a different kind of trap. "Let him go," she told Matthias. "What?" The information broker looked incredulous. "He's a conspirator. He's a terrified kid who is following orders to keep his job," Celine cut him off. "And we're going to use him." She turned to Devin. "You're going to go back to work. You're going to finish those forgeries exactly as Vivianne ordered. You're going to give her no reason to suspect you've talked to us." "I don't understand." "You don't have to. Just do your job. And when this is over, if you've done exactly what I'm asking, I'll make sure you walk away from this alive." Devin's eyes were still wide with fear, but he nodded. After Matthias escorted him out, Iris turned on Celine. "You're letting him go back? What if he reports this conversation?" "He won't. He's more afraid of Vivianne than he is of us, which means he'll do exactly what we tell him to avoid getting caught between 2 sides." Celine started pacing, the plan forming as she moved. Vivianne's going to present forged evidence in 3 days. She thinks she's springing a trap. But what if we turn it into her public execution instead? How? By making sure that when she accuses me of embezzlement, I have proof, real proof, that every document she's presenting is a forgery, that she's been manufacturing evidence as part of a broader conspiracy. She stopped pacing, and by making sure the entire court sees her revealed as a spy working for Duke Kensington. You said you weren't ready to expose the espionage, Iris protested. I said I wanted to wait for maximum damage. Well, 3 days before I'm arrested for treason qualifies as maximum damage. Celine's mind was moving fast now, calculating angles. We move everything up, accelerate the timeline. Matthias, I need you to get me the original transfer records from before Vivianne started altering them. Every document that proves the forgeries are fake. That will take time. The archives are, you have 2 days. Use whatever resources you need. Bribe whoever you have to bribe. But get me those records. The old spy nodded and left. Celine turned to Iris. I need you to contact Elena. Tell her I need that intercepted letter from Vivianne to Duke Kensington, the one with intelligence about military positions. And I need proof of authenticity, something that shows it's Vivianne's handwriting, her cipher, her seal. What are you planning? To walk into that council session in 3 days and turn Vivianne's trap into her grave. The next 2 days were a blur of sleepless nights and careful choreography. Matthias returned with original treasury records that showed the signatures on Vivianne's forged documents were subtly different, pressure points wrong, letter spacing inconsistent, ink composition mismatched. Small details a casual observer would miss, but an expert forensic analyst would catch immediately. Elena delivered the intercepted letter along with 3 others they'd collected over the past month. Proof of ongoing espionage. Proof of intelligence being sold to foreign powers. Proof written in Vivianne's own handwriting with her personal seal pressed into red wax. Theron quietly assembled the 3 generals who hadn't gone silent, Aldwych and 2 others who'd decided that General Marcus's murder was a line too far. They agreed to attend the council session, agreed to provide testimony if needed, agreed that stopping a spy was more important than protecting a king who'd been too blind to see the viper in his bed. And Celine prepared herself for the performance of her life. On the morning of the council session, she dressed with deliberate care. Dark gray silk that looked almost like armor. Hair pulled back severe enough to expose the sharp lines of her face. No jewelry except her father's signet ring on her right hand, not the left where her wedding ring used to sit. She looked like a blade. That was the point. Iris helped her with the final touches, her old hand steadier than Celine's. You ready for this? No, but I'm doing it anyway. That's what your mother used to say before major battles. Did she ever lose? Iris's expression flickered. Once. The one that killed her. Celine absorbed this in silence. Then she squared her shoulders and walked toward the council chamber like she was walking toward her own execution, which she might be. If this went wrong, if Vivianne's trap closed before Celine could spring her counter-trap, she'd be arrested before sunset and dead before the week ended. The council chamber was already full when she arrived. All the major nobles, the senior ministers, the military leadership that hadn't fled or been murdered. Cedric sat at the head of the table wearing his crown and an expression of barely concealed vindication. Vivianne perched beside him in crimson silk, looking like a cardinal bird that had learned to smile. Celine took her seat at the far end of the table, the position they'd moved her to months ago, the position of someone who no longer mattered. Let them think that. Let them believe she was toothless. Cedric called the session to order with a voice that tried for authority and landed somewhere near petulance. We're here to address multiple crises, the merchant rebellions, the treasury shortfalls, and new evidence that has come to my attention regarding the source of our kingdom's economic instability. Here it comes, Celine thought. Lady Vivianne, Cedric continued, has been conducting a private investigation into treasury irregularities. She's discovered evidence of systematic embezzlement spanning several years. Evidence that points to, he paused for effect, someone within the royal family itself. Gasps rippled around the table. Performative shock. Everyone here knew where this was heading. Vivianne stood carrying a leather portfolio thick with documents. Your Majesty, nobles of the court, what I'm about to present is disturbing, but truth, however painful, must be brought to light. She opened the portfolio. Over the past 3 months, I've discovered that Queen Selene has been systematically stealing from the royal treasury, forging transfer authorizations, redirecting funds to private accounts, using her position to enrich herself while the kingdom suffers. She spread documents across the table, transfer orders with Selene's signature, authorization forms with her seal, evidence that looked damning because it was designed to look damning. "This is fantasy," Selene said calmly. "And you know it." "These are official documents bearing your signature," Vivienne shot back. Her voice carried triumph. "Are you denying these are yours?" "I'm denying I authorized them. There's a difference." Cedric leaned forward. "You're saying someone forged royal documents? That's a serious accusation, not as serious as actual treason." Selene stood, pulling her own documents from inside her jacket. "Because while Lady Vivienne has been busy manufacturing evidence against me, I've been gathering real evidence against her." She laid the intercepted letters on the table. 4 of them, each bearing Vivienne's handwriting, each containing intelligence sold to Duke Kensington. The room went dead silent. "What are those?" Cedric's voice had lost its certainty. "Letters," Selene said. "Correspondence between your mistress and a foreign noble who's been preparing to invade our kingdom using intelligence she provided. Military positions, treasury reserves, guard rotations. Everything an enemy would need to strike when we're most vulnerable." Vivienne's face had gone white. "Those are forgeries." "Are they?" Selene picked up one letter, reading aloud. "Eastern garrison reduced to skeleton crew. Supply lines vulnerable at Junction Point 7. Treasury reserves depleted by new construction projects." She looked up. "That construction would be your new solarium, wouldn't it? The one you just started building using crown funds?" "This is absurd," Vivienne said, but her voice had developed a tremor. "I don't even know Duke Kensington." "Then explain how letters written in your handwriting, sealed with your personal seal, ended up in his possession." Selene turned to the assembled nobles. "Explain how classified military intelligence ended up across the border. Explain how an enemy duke knew exactly where to strike when our defenses were weakest." Cedric stood, his face cycling through emotions too fast to track. "You're lying. You're making this up to discredit—" General Aldwych rose from his seat. "Your Majesty, I've reviewed these letters. The intelligence they contain is accurate, detailed, the kind of information only someone with deep access to Crown operations would possess." Another general stood. "I can confirm the same. Our enemy has been moving troops to positions that exploit weaknesses Lady Vivienne would have known about." Cedric looked between the generals and Vivienne and Selene like a man drowning. No, this isn't— Vivienne wouldn't— "Wouldn't what?" Selene's voice cut through the chaos. "Wouldn't betray you the way you betrayed me? Wouldn't sell the kingdom for personal gain? The way you've been doing for months?" She stepped toward him. "You chose this woman over me. You gave her power over treasury operations, over military appointments, over the entire economic infrastructure, and she used every piece of that power to destroy us from within." Cedric's face had gone red. "I won't listen to this. You're jealous. You're trying to destroy her because you can't accept that I don't love you anymore." The words should have hurt. A year ago they would have devastated her. But standing here now, watching a kingdom crumble because a king chose his ego over competence, Selene felt nothing but cold clarity. "You're right," she said quietly. "I can't accept that you value a spy over the woman who spent 15 years building everything you inherited. But this isn't about your feelings or mine. This is about treason. Real treason. And if you can't see that, if you're so blinded by infatuation that you can't recognize an enemy agent when she's sleeping in your bed, then you're not fit to rule." The room erupted, nobles shouting over each other, Cedric screaming that she had no right to question his authority, Vivienne shrieking that this was a conspiracy against her. And through the chaos, Selene saw it happen. Vivienne's eyes met someone's across the room, a flicker of communication, a signal Selene almost missed. Then Theron was grabbing her arm, pulling her back. "Get down!" The explosion came from everywhere and nowhere, sound and pressure and heat slamming through the council chamber like the fist of an angry god. Selene hit the floor hard, her ears ringing, dust and smoke filling her lungs. When the world stopped spinning, she looked up through debris and found chaos. The far wall had collapsed. Bodies lay scattered, some moving, some not. Blood pooled on marble floors that had been pristine minutes ago. Someone was screaming, multiple someones. Celine dragged herself upright, coughing, searching through the smoke for Cedric, for Vivienne, for anyone who could explain what the hell just happened. She found Theron first, pinned under rubble but alive. Then General Aldwych, blood streaming from a head wound but conscious. Then she found Cedric. He was slumped against the table, his crown knocked askew, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps, but alive. Still alive. Vivienne was gone. Celine stumbled through the wreckage, her mind struggling to process. A bomb. Someone had planted a bomb in the council chamber. Someone who knew exactly when the session would take place. Someone who wanted everyone in this room dead. Guards poured in, shouting orders, pulling nobles from debris. Medics arrived. Someone wrapped a bandage around Celine's arm, and she looked down to find blood, her blood, soaking through torn silk. She didn't remember getting injured. "Your Majesty," a guard was saying, "Your Majesty, you need to evacuate. The structure isn't stable." "Where's Vivienne?" Celine demanded. The guard's face was grim. "Lady Vivienne left the chamber moments before the explosion. She's being sought for questioning." "She left before the bomb went off," Celine repeated. "Because she knew. Because she set this up." The guard didn't answer, didn't need to. Celine looked around at the destroyed council chamber, at the dead and dying, at a kingdom that had just been gutted by a woman who'd spent months burrowing into its heart like a parasite. She'd been played, completely, thoroughly. She'd thought she was setting a trap, and instead she'd walked into an ambush. Vivienne hadn't been planning to win at the council session. She'd been planning to eliminate everyone who might oppose her in a single devastating strike, and she'd nearly succeeded. Theron appeared at her elbow, limping, his face covered in stone dust. "We need to move, now. If Vivienne set this bomb, she'll have backup plans." "Where's Cedric?" "Being evacuated. He's alive, but injured. They're taking him to the royal physician." Celine nodded, then turned and walked toward the exit, each step sending pain shooting through her ribs. Behind her, the council chamber burned. Ahead, a kingdom teetered on the edge of civil war. She'd lost. She'd gambled everything on exposing Vivienne at the council session and instead gotten people killed. Her evidence was now buried in rubble. Her allies were dead or injured. Her husband was barely conscious, and her enemy had vanished into the city with a head start and nothing to lose. Everything she'd built over the past months, the careful planning, the quiet resistance, the network of allies, had been shattered in a single explosion. But as she emerged into daylight, breathing air that didn't taste like blood and smoke, Celine felt something unexpected crystallizing in her chest. Rage. Not the hot, impulsive kind that burned out fast. The cold kind. The methodical kind. The kind that would tear down kingdoms and rebuild them from ash. Vivienne wanted to play with fire? Fine. Celine would show her what happened when you tried to burn a woman who'd already walked through hell and come out the other side. The game had changed. No more careful moves. No more quiet resistance. No more playing by rules that only applied to one side. If Vivienne wanted war, Celine would give her annihilation. She stood in the palace courtyard, covered in blood and dust, watching smoke pour from the council chamber, and made a decision that would have horrified the woman she used to be. She was done being the good queen, the patient wife, the woman who solved problems through diplomacy and careful strategy. That woman had gotten people killed. The woman she was becoming wouldn't make the same mistake. Iris found her there, standing in the smoke, staring at the ruined palace with eyes that had gone flat and cold as winter ice. "What do we do now?" the old woman asked. Celine turned, looked at her father's loyal servant with a smile that held no warmth. "Now," she said quietly, "we stop playing by their rules. We stop trying to save a kingdom that doesn't want to be saved. And we do what my mother should have taught me years ago." "What's that?" "When they try to bury you, don't climb out." Iris looked confused. "Burn the whole garden down from underground," Celine finished, "and rise from the ash wearing their bones as a crown." The palace burned for 3 hours before the flames were finally contained. By then, half the east wing had collapsed into smoking rubble, and the council chamber was nothing but blackened stone and the ghosts of people who'd been standing in the wrong place when Vivienne's bomb went off. Celine watched it burn from the old guard tower, the highest point in the palace complex that hadn't been structurally compromised. Smoke rose into a sky that had turned the color of old bruises. Below, servants and soldiers ran like ants whose hill had been kicked, trying to salvage what could be saved and abandoning what couldn't. 7 nobles dead, 12 injured. One of the dead was Lord Treasurer Harwick, who'd served 3 kings and survived 2 wars, only to be killed by a woman wearing silk and ambition-like armor. The count would rise. It always did after bombings. People who looked fine in the immediate aftermath would die hours or days later from internal injuries nobody saw coming. Theron stood beside her, his left arm in a sling, a bandage wrapped around his head, turning slowly red as his wound seeped through the cloth. "We need to move you to a secure location. If Vivienne can plant a bomb in the council chamber, nowhere in this palace is safe." Celine didn't take her eyes off the burning wing. "Where's Cedric? Royal Physician's quarters. Under guard. He's conscious but not coherent. Keeps asking for Vivienne. Of course he does. Even now, even after being presented with evidence of treason, even after a bomb that nearly killed him, Cedric's first instinct was to reach for the woman who'd orchestrated it all. Some men would rather die than admit they'd been played for fools. Has anyone found her? No. She had horses waiting outside the palace grounds. Multiple witnesses saw her leave minutes before the explosion. She's probably halfway to the border by now. Then we go after her. Theron turned sharply. "Your Majesty, you're injured. You need medical attention, and you need to secure your position here before what? Before the kingdom tears itself apart? It's already happening, Theron. Look at it." Celine gestured at the chaos below. "We have a wounded king, a missing traitor, a power vacuum the size of the eastern provinces, and every noble house in the capital wondering if they're next on Vivienne's list. I can either hide in a secure location and watch everything burn, or I can hunt down the woman who started the fire and end this before more people die. You're talking about leaving the capital, leaving Cedric defenseless while you chase. I'm talking about cutting the head off the snake before it poisons what's left of this kingdom." Celine finally looked at him. Vivienne didn't act alone. She had help planting that bomb. She had support from people inside this palace, which means we have traitors in our ranks and no way to know who we can trust. So yes, I'm leaving. Because the only way to find out who's working with her is to make them think they've won. That's insane. That's strategy. Celine started toward the stairs leading down from the tower. If I stay, I'm a target. If I run, I draw out everyone who wants me dead. And when they show themselves, I'll know exactly who needs to be eliminated. Where are you going? To see my husband, then to gather whoever's still loyal, then to do what I should have done months ago, stop playing defense and start cutting throats. The royal physician's quarters smelled like blood and burned flesh, and the acrid tang of medicine that couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of dying. Celine pushed through the door without knocking, ignoring the protests of guards who weren't sure if she still had authority to ignore. Cedric lay on a narrow bed, his chest wrapped in bandages, his face pale, except where bruises were already forming. The physician, an elderly woman named Mara, who'd been delivering bad news to royalty for 40 years, looked up as Celine entered. He shouldn't have visitors. He needs rest. He'll have eternity to rest if we don't stop the person who tried to kill him. Celine moved to the bedside. How bad is it? 3 broken ribs, severe bruising, minor burns. He's lucky the table took most of the blast. Mara's expression was professionally neutral, but her eyes held judgment, luckier than some. Celine absorbed this. Cedric would live, he'd be in pain for weeks, but he'd survive, which meant she couldn't use his death as justification for what she was planning to do next. She'd have to find another justification, or stop caring about justification entirely. Cedric's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then landing on her face. "Celine? I'm here. Where's Vivienne? Did she tried to kill you," Celine said flatly. "She planted a bomb in the council chamber and murdered 7 people. Then she fled the city before anyone could stop her." "No." Cedric tried to sit up, gasped in pain, fell back. "No, you're lying. You set this up. You tried to frame her, and when that didn't work, I showed you evidence of her treason, letters proving she was selling intelligence to our enemies, and you still can't accept it." Celine felt something cold and final settle in her chest. You'd rather believe I'm capable of mass murder than admit the woman you chose over me was using you from the start. She wouldn't. Cedric's voice cracked. She loved me. She loved your crown. There's a difference. Celine turned to leave, then paused. I'm going after her. I'm going to stop her before she does any more damage. And when I bring her back in chains, when I present proof of her crimes that even you can't deny, you're going to have to decide something important. What? Whether you're a king who serves his kingdom or a fool who serves his ego. Because right now you're acting like the second, and this realm can't afford that luxury anymore. She left before he could respond. Left him lying in that narrow bed with his broken ribs and his shattered illusions. Part of her, a small part she didn't like acknowledging, hoped the truth would hurt worse than the physical injuries. The rest of her didn't care. She was done trying to save a man who'd chosen his own destruction over her partnership. Iris found her in the armory, strapping on leather riding gear and checking the edge on a short sword that had belonged to her father. The old woman's face was grim. You're really doing this. Did you think I wasn't? I think you're about to do something that can't be undone. Once you leave this palace, once you start hunting Vivienne like an animal, you're not coming back as the same person. Good. The person I was got people killed. Celine buckled the sword belt around her waist. Time to become someone who prevents that. Your mother said something similar once, right before the battle that took her life. Celine paused. What battle? The one she chose to fight alone because she didn't trust anyone else to do it right. The one where she rode into enemy territory with a handful of loyal soldiers and never rode back. Iris moved closer. You have her eyes, her stubbornness, her absolute certainty that she knows best. But girl, you also have her blind spots. And the biggest one is thinking you can save a kingdom by destroying yourself in the process. I'm not trying to save the kingdom anymore. I'm trying to stop the woman who's actively destroying it. That's different. Is it? Because from where I stand, it looks like you're planning to chase Vivienne across the countryside, probably into a trap, definitely without adequate support, all because you'd rather die fighting than live with the knowledge that she got away. Celine met the old woman's eyes. And if I am? Then I'm coming with you, because someone needs to keep you alive long enough to regret your stupid decisions. Despite everything, the pain, the exhaustion, the cold rage sitting like ice in her lungs, Celine smiled. You're 70 years old, and I've buried 3 monarchs. I'm not about to bury a 4th because she had her mother's courage and her father's strategic brilliance, but neither of their common sense. Fine. Get your riding gear. We leave in an hour. Iris nodded and turned to go, then stopped. Celine? Your mother died alone because she refused help. Don't make the same mistake. Let people fight beside you. Let them be loyal, because the alternative is dying with nothing but your pride for company. After she left, Celine stood alone in the armory surrounded by weapons that had been forged for wars fought by people long dead. She thought about her mother, a woman she'd never known, who'd become more legend than memory, a woman who'd ridden to battle alone and never returned. Maybe Iris was right. Maybe this was repeating history instead of learning from it. Or maybe some battles could only be fought alone because bringing others along just meant more casualties when everything went to hell. Celine didn't know which was true, but she was about to find out. Theron assembled 8 soldiers, men who'd served under him for years, who'd sworn oaths to the kingdom rather than the king, who'd looked at the destroyed council chamber and decided they were done watching from the sidelines. They met in the old stables where the smell of horses and leather masked the scent of smoke that had infiltrated every corner of the palace. This is a hunting party, Celine told them. Not a military operation. We're going after a single target who's extremely dangerous and probably not working alone. Some of you might not come back. Anyone who wants to walk away now, do it. No judgment, no consequences. Nobody moved. The oldest soldier, a man named Garrett, who had scars on his face from battles Celine had only heard stories about, spoke up. Your Majesty, we watched you spend 15 years holding this kingdom together while the king played at being royal. We watched you get shoved aside for a woman who turned out to be a traitor. We watched you almost die in that council chamber today. He looked around at the other soldiers. None of us are here because we think you're perfect. We're here because we think you're right. And because someone needs to stop pretending the king knows what he's doing. Several men nodded agreement. Celine felt something catch in her throat. Not tears. She'd forgotten how to cry somewhere between the anniversary banquet and the moment she'd pulled her wedding ring off her finger. But something close. Recognition, maybe. The realization that she wasn't as alone as she'd convinced herself she was. "Thank you," she said. "Then let's move before someone decides to stop us." They rode out through the servants' gate an hour before dawn, 10 riders on fast horses, carrying light armor and weapons they hoped they wouldn't need to use. Matthias had given them Vivian's likely route, northwest toward the border, probably stopping at friendly noble houses along the way, definitely planning to cross into Duke Kensington's territory, where she'd be beyond Celine's reach. The plan was simple: catch her before she reached the border, capture her alive if possible, kill her if necessary, bring back proof of her crimes that even Cedric couldn't dismiss. Simple plans had a way of falling apart the moment contact was made with reality. They rode hard for 6 hours, changing horses twice at way stations where loyal merchants were still willing to help despite the chaos in the capital. The countryside rolled past in shades of brown and gray, fields harvested bare for winter, trees stripped of leaves, sky the color of old steel. This was the kingdom most nobles never saw. The working land. The places where people broke their backs growing food that fed cities they'd never visit. Celine had seen it before on diplomatic tours, but always from carriages, always surrounded by guards and ceremony and the insulation wealth provided. Riding through it now, she understood something her father had tried to teach her. A kingdom wasn't the palace or the court or the elaborate political games nobles played. It was this, the land and the people who worked it, and the fragile web of trust that held everything together. Vivian had tried to tear that web apart for profit and foreign favor. And she'd nearly succeeded because Cedric had been too blind to see the damage until it was catastrophic. That couldn't happen again. Whatever Celine became after this, queen, exile, corpse, she couldn't let someone like Vivian hold power over people who'd done nothing to deserve the suffering that followed. They caught up to Vivian's party 3 hours before sunset, on a stretch of road that cut through dense forest. Matthias's intelligence had been accurate. She'd stopped at a minor noble's estate to rest and resupply. The noble in question, Lord Brenner, was one of the men who'd grown wealthy under Vivian's economic schemes. One of the collaborators who'd profited while the kingdom bled. Celine's group waited in the tree line, watching the estate house through bare branches. Smoke rose from chimneys. Guards patrolled the perimeter, more guards than a minor noble should have, which confirmed Brenner was expecting trouble. "She's still inside," Theron confirmed, lowering a spyglass. "I count 12 guards, maybe more inside the house." "We're outnumbered," Garrett observed. "We're always outnumbered. That's never stopped us before." Theron looked at Celine. "Your call, Your Majesty. Do we wait for her to leave and ambush on the road? Or do we go in now while she thinks she's safe?" Celine studied the estate. Waiting was smarter, less risky, more likely to succeed. But waiting also gave Vivian time to receive reinforcements, time to prepare, time to slip away again if she suspected pursuit. And Celine was done with waiting, done with careful plans that depended on other people behaving predictably, done with strategy that assumed enemies would play fair. "We go in now," she said, "hard and fast. We take the guards by surprise, secure Vivian, get out before they can organize a response." "That's not a plan," Theron protested. "That's barely a hope. It's what we have." Celine checked her sword, making sure it moved smoothly in its sheath. "Anyone got a better idea?" Silence. "Then let's move." They hit the estate like a storm that had been building for months and finally made landfall. Garrett and 3 soldiers took the front gate. Theron and 2 others went for the side entrance. Celine, Iris, and 2 men circled to the rear where servant quarters offered less defended access. The fighting started before they reached the house. Someone saw them coming, raised an alarm, and suddenly the courtyard was full of armed men pouring from the guardhouse. Celine drew her sword and discovered something she'd never known about herself. She was good at violence, not in a trained military way, in a raw, desperate way that came from having nothing left to lose and everything to prove. She moved on instinct, blocking strikes, finding openings, driving her blade into flesh that gave way easier than she'd expected. Blood sprayed hot across her face. Someone screamed. Her blade stuck in bone, and she had to wrench it free, her hands slippery with gore, her breath coming in gasps that burned her lungs. This was nothing like the courtly duels nobles practiced for entertainment. This was butchery. This was survival. This was learning that the distance between civilized queen and killer was just one moment of letting the rage take over. She fought her way to the house, Iris beside her swinging a short blade with the efficiency of someone who'd seen combat before, one of the soldiers ahead of her cutting through Brenner's guards with mechanical precision. The main hall was chaos. Brenner himself stood at the top of the stairs, shouting orders that nobody followed because everyone was too busy trying not to die. And behind him, Vivienne appeared wearing traveling clothes and carrying a small case that probably contained everything she'd stolen that could fit in portable form. Their eyes met across the carnage. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Just two women who'd been circling each other for months, who'd both believed they were winning, who'd both been wrong in different ways. Then Vivienne ran. Celine went after her, taking the stairs 3 at a time, her leg muscles screaming protest. Behind her, the sounds of fighting continued. Steel on steel, men dying. The wet sounds of violence that no ballad ever captured accurately. Vivienne fled down a corridor toward the back of the house. Celine followed, her vision narrowing to tunnel focus, her world reduced to the woman ahead of her and the rage that had been building since the anniversary banquet when she'd first understood what was being stolen from her. The corridor opened onto a balcony overlooking the estate's rear gardens. Vivienne spun, pulling a small knife from inside her dress. Her perfect face was flushed, her breathing ragged, her eyes wild with the particular panic that came from realizing the trap had finally closed. "You just won't quit, will you?" Vivienne's voice shook. "You just can't accept that you lost, that he chose me, that I'm better than you in every way that matters to him. You tried to kill me," Celine said. "You murdered 7 people. You sold military intelligence to an enemy power. And you think this is about Cedric's affection? Isn't it?" Vivienne's laugh had a hysterical edge. "Isn't that what this whole pathetic crusade has been about? The rejected wife who can't move on?" Celine felt something cold settle in her chest. The rage that had been driving her for weeks suddenly crystallized into something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. This was never about Cedric. This was about you thinking you could tear apart a kingdom and face no consequences. This was about you believing charm and beauty could substitute for competence. This was about you learning what happens when you underestimate the woman you tried to replace. She moved forward. Vivienne slashed with the knife. Celine caught her wrist, twisted, and heard the small bones crack. Vivienne screamed and dropped the blade. Celine drove her knee into the other woman's stomach, doubling her over, then grabbed a fistful of that perfect hair and slammed her head into the balcony railing. Vivienne collapsed, blood streaming from her nose, her eyes unfocused. Celine stood over her, breathing hard, her hands shaking with adrenaline and rage, and something that felt horribly like satisfaction. She'd imagined this moment so many times over the past months. The confrontation, the triumph, the moment when she finally made Vivienne understand exactly what she'd taken and what it cost. But standing here now, with her enemy broken and bleeding at her feet, Celine felt nothing but hollow exhaustion. Winning didn't feel like she'd thought it would. It just felt like surviving. Footsteps behind her. Theron emerged onto the balcony, blood on his sword, his face grim. "The house is secure. Brenner's dead. Most of his guards surrendered when they realized they were losing. And our people? 2 wounded. None killed. We got lucky." Celine looked down at Vivienne, who was trying to push herself upright, her face a mask of blood and hatred. "This is lucky? Compared to the alternative." Theron moved closer, lowering his voice. "What do we do with her?" Celine crouched beside Vivienne, grabbing her chin, forcing eye contact. "You're going back to the capital. You're going to stand trial for treason. You're going to confess everything, the espionage, the embezzlement, the bombing. And then you're going to die publicly so everyone understands what happens to people who betray this kingdom." Vivienne spat blood. "Cedric will never allow it. He loves me. Cedric nearly died because of you, and even he's not stupid enough to protect a woman who tried to murder him." Celine released her, standing. "But if you want to test that theory, we can arrange a reunion. I'm sure it'll be touching." She turned away before she did something she'd regret. Before the cold rage crystallized into something worse. Before she stopped being the queen who fought for justice and became the monster who fought for vengeance. There was a difference. She had to believe there was a difference. They bound Vivienne and put her on a horse, surrounded by guards, who looked like they'd prefer if she tried to escape, so they'd have an excuse to kill her. The ride back to the capital took 2 days, and every mile felt like riding through a kingdom that was barely holding together. They passed through villages where people watched with hollow eyes, where children looked underfed and adults looked exhausted, where the markers of Cedric's incompetence and Vivienne's greed were written in empty granaries and shuttered shops, and fields gone to weed because farmers couldn't afford to plant. This was the real cost. Not the dead nobles in the council chamber, not the destroyed wing of the palace. This, the slow starvation of a kingdom that had been bled dry by people who viewed it as a resource to be exploited rather than a trust to be protected. Celine had been so focused on stopping Vivienne that she hadn't fully grasped the scale of damage that needed to be repaired. It would take years, maybe decades, and it would require leadership that actually gave a damn about something beyond personal power. Leadership Cedric had never demonstrated he possessed. That realization settled like lead in her stomach. She'd spent 15 years trying to turn him into a competent ruler. 15 years of patience and compromise and swallowing her own ambitions to support his. 15 years that had produced a king who'd chosen a spy over his kingdom and nearly gotten himself killed for the privilege. At some point, trying to save a drowning man who kept swimming toward deeper water stopped being compassion and started being complicity in your own destruction. They reached the capital on the third day after leaving Brenner's estate. The city looked different now, tense, uncertain, like it was holding its breath waiting for the next disaster. Guards at the gate recognized Celine and let them pass without question. Word had spread about what happened, about the queen who'd ridden out to hunt a traitor and come back with her in chains. The crowd that gathered as they rode through the streets wasn't the performative display of nobles doing what they thought they should. This was ordinary people, merchants and laborers and servants, who'd been suffering under economic policies they didn't understand and were finally seeing someone held accountable. They didn't cheer. They just watched. Watched Vivienne bound and bloodied. Watched Celine riding at the head of the column with a sword at her hip and exhaustion carved into her face. Watched and waited to see what would happen next. The palace courtyard was full when they arrived. Nobles and ministers and military leadership all gathered like they'd been summoned. Cedric stood at the top of the main steps, leaning on a cane, his chest still wrapped in bandages. His face went through several emotions when he saw Vivienne. Shock, grief, denial, and finally something that might have been understanding. Celine dismounted, every muscle in her body screaming protest. She climbed the steps slowly, aware of every eye tracking her movement. When she reached Cedric, she stopped. "Lady Vivienne Mercer," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Traitor, spy, attempted murderer. I'm presenting her for trial and execution as prescribed by law for crimes against the crown." Cedric looked at Vivienne, then at Celine, then back at the woman he'd chosen over his wife. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Take her to the dungeons," he said finally. His voice was barely audible. "Cedric," Vivienne started. "Get her out of my sight." Guards moved forward, dragging Vivienne away. She fought, screaming obscenities and accusations, swearing revenge, promising that Duke Kensington would invade and burn the capital and everyone would regret this. Nobody listened. She had become what she'd always been beneath the beautiful surface. Noise without substance. Rage without power. A threat that had been neutralized. The courtyard cleared slowly. Nobles retreating to process what they'd witnessed. Ministers huddling to discuss implications. Soldiers returning to their posts now that the immediate crisis had passed. Eventually, only Celine and Cedric remained on the steps. "You should be resting," she said. "So should you." He studied her face. "You look like hell. I feel worse." Silence settled between them. Not comfortable, not quite hostile. Just the exhausted quiet of two people who'd been through something catastrophic and survived, but didn't know what came next. "I was wrong," Cedric said finally. "About her. About you. About everything." Celine waited for the satisfaction that admission should bring. It didn't come. Just more exhaustion. Being right didn't feel like winning when the cost was this high. "Yes," she said, "you were. I don't know how to fix this. The kingdom, us, any of it. There is no us anymore, Cedric. That ended months ago, maybe years ago. We just kept pretending because it was easier than admitting the truth." "What truth?" "That you never actually wanted a partner. You wanted someone to manage the parts of ruling you found boring so you could enjoy the parts you liked. And I spent 15 years letting you do exactly that because I was stupid enough to believe it was love. It was love. His voice cracked. I did love you. You loved what I could do for you. There's a difference. Celine turned to face him fully. But that's done now, so here's what happens next. You're going to formally charge Viviane with treason. You're going to sign emergency economic reforms that reverse every policy she implemented. You're going to release grain reserves to prevent famine. And you're going to start acting like a king who gives a damn about his kingdom instead of a child playing dress-up. And if I don't, then I'll call for a vote of no confidence in front of the entire nobility. I'll present evidence that you were either complicit in Viviane's treason or too incompetent to notice it happening in your own bed. And I'll let the court decide whether keeping you on the throne is worth the risk of the kingdom collapsing completely. The color drained from Cedric's face. That's a coup. That's accountability. Something you've avoided for 15 years because I was always there to catch you when you fell. But I'm done catching you, Cedric. From now on, you either stand on your own or you fall. Your choice. She walked past him into the palace, leaving him standing alone on the steps where she'd found him. Inside, the palace felt different. Darker. Colder. Like the bomb had damaged more than just physical structure. It had cracked something in the foundation that couldn't be easily repaired. Iris found her in her father's study, standing at the window, watching the sun set over a capital that had barely survived the day. You did it, the old woman said. Did I? Because it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like I just prevented one kind of disaster while setting the stage for another. That's because you're finally understanding what your parents knew. There are no victories in ruling, only problems you manage until they become someone else's problems. Celine turned from the window. Tell me about my mother. The real story, not the legend. Iris was quiet for a long moment. Then she sat, her old bones creaking, and began to speak. Your mother was brilliant, terrifying, absolutely certain she was right about everything. She and your father ruled together for 10 years, and in that time they transformed this kingdom from a minor power into something that mattered. But the cost, the personal cost, it destroyed her piece by piece. She saw enemies everywhere, trusted no one, made decisions that were strategically perfect but morally devastating. And then she rode off to fight one final battle alone because she'd pushed away everyone who might have helped her. How did she die? In combat, outnumbered, surrounded, fighting to the last breath because surrendering wasn't in her vocabulary. Iris met Celine's eyes. She died proving she was right, but being right didn't save her, didn't save the soldiers who died beside her, didn't save your father from grief that eventually killed him too. You think I'm becoming her. I think you're at a crossroads. One path leads to becoming the kind of ruler your mother was, effective, feared, alone, and ultimately destroyed by her own refusal to trust anyone. The other path, Iris paused. I don't know where it leads, but it starts with deciding whether you're fighting to save a kingdom or fighting because you don't know how to do anything else anymore. Celine looked out at the darkening city. Lights were beginning to appear in windows. People settling in for the night, living lives that had nothing to do with palace politics or royal succession or the elaborate games of power that consumed everyone inside these walls. Those people deserved better than what they'd been getting. They deserved a ruler who actually cared whether they starved or froze or died because some noble decided their lives were worth less than profit margins. Whether that ruler was Cedric or Celine or someone else entirely, that was the question she'd been avoiding since the moment she removed her wedding ring and decided to fight back. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow I'll decide. Tonight, I just want to sit here and pretend the kingdom isn't falling apart. Fair enough. Iris stood to leave, then paused. One more thing. The nobles are already talking about what you did, how you rode out and brought back a traitor, how you stood up to the king, how you're the one who actually seems to know what she's doing, and if you wanted to push for real change, structural change, now would be the time. While everyone's still processing what happened, while Cedric's still weak, while you have momentum, you're saying I should stage a coup. I'm saying you're already halfway there. You have military support, popular support, evidence that the current king is incompetent at best and complicit at worst. The pieces are in place. The question is whether you have the courage to move them. Celine didn't answer, just sat in the darkness, watching the city lights multiply as night fell fully. Somewhere in the dungeons below, Vivienne sat in chains awaiting trial and execution. Somewhere in the palace, Cedric lay injured and broken, wondering how everything had fallen apart so completely. And somewhere in between, in the space where power sat waiting for someone to claim it, Celine felt the future crystallizing into a shape she hadn't fully anticipated but couldn't deny anymore. Tomorrow, she'd change the kingdom. Tonight, she let herself be tired. But even exhaustion couldn't silence the voice in her head, asking the question that had been building since the moment she'd removed her wedding ring. If she was going to tear down everything they'd built and rebuild from ash, why stop at removing Vivienne? Why not burn it all? The trial lasted 3 days and felt like 3 years. They held it in what remained of the Grand Hall, the only space large enough to accommodate every noble, minister, and military officer who demanded to witness Vivienne Mercer's judgment. Workers had cleared the debris and covered the bomb damage with temporary scaffolding, but you could still smell the char in the air, still see the scorch marks on marble that had stood unblemished for centuries. The room itself was a testament to what happened when ambition became poison. Celine sat in the witness section, not on the throne where custom dictated she should be. That belonged to Cedric, and watching him occupy it felt like watching a child play king in his father's clothes. He looked diminished somehow, not just physically, though his injuries had left him gaunt and pale. Something deeper had broken when he'd finally accepted what Vivienne had been, the illusion of his own judgment, the comfortable fiction that he'd been in control. Vivienne stood in chains before the court, her beauty turned savage by 3 weeks in the dungeons. Her perfect hair hung in matted tangles. Her skin had lost its luminous quality, replaced by the gray pallor of someone who'd stopped believing in survival. But her eyes still burned with defiance. She'd die before she admitted weakness. Celine understood that impulse better than she wanted to. The prosecution presented evidence in waves that built like a storm surge. The intercepted letters proving espionage. The forged treasury documents. Testimony from Devin and the other clerks who'd been coerced into creating false records. General Aldwick's detailed account of how classified intelligence had ended up in enemy hands. The list of dead from the council chamber bombing, read aloud in a voice that cracked on the name of Lord Treasurer Harwick, who'd served 3 kings and deserved better than to die in a political assassination. Through it all, Vivienne said nothing, didn't defend herself, didn't beg for mercy, just stood there with her chin raised and her eyes fixed on some point above the crowd, as if she'd already left this place in spirit even though her body remained. On the 3rd day, when the evidence had been exhausted and the verdict was inevitable, Cedric finally spoke the words everyone had been waiting for. Lady Vivienne Mercer, you stand accused of treason against the crown, espionage in service of foreign powers, embezzlement, conspiracy to commit murder, and the deaths of 7 nobles in the council chamber bombing. The evidence presented is overwhelming, the testimony damning. Do you have anything to say in your own defense? Vivienne's laugh was sharp and broken. Defense? What defense could I possibly offer? You've already decided I'm guilty. You and your pathetic court and that frigid bitch you call a wife. Several nobles gasped. Cedric's face flushed red. But Celine just sat there, feeling nothing. Words that would have wounded her months ago now just sounded like noise from someone who'd already lost. Yes, I sold your secrets, Vivienne continued, her voice rising. Yes, I took your money. Yes, I tried to kill you all. And you know what? I'd do it again. Because this kingdom deserves to burn for what it did to people like me, for taking girls from farms and grinding them under your boots and telling them they should be grateful for the privilege of serving their betters. Her eyes found Celine's across the crowd. You think you're different? You think you're noble? You're just another predator who got lucky enough to be born with a crown. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the guards looked uncomfortable, like they'd witnessed something too raw and real for the performative justice of a royal trial. Cedric cleared his throat. The court finds you guilty on all charges. The sentence is death by execution, to be carried out at dawn tomorrow in the public square. May whatever mercy exists in this world find you, because you'll receive none from us. They led her away still laughing, a sound that echoed off stone walls and burrowed into the parts of Celine's mind that would never fully heal. Because beneath the cruelty and the treason and the murderous ambition, Vivienne had spoken a truth nobody wanted to acknowledge. She'd been right about one thing. This kingdom did grind up people who weren't born into protection and power. And the fact that Celine had been fortunate enough to be born royal didn't make that reality any less brutal. After the trial ended and the nobles dispersed to gossip and process and plan their next political moves, Celine found herself alone in her father's study again. The room had become her refuge, the only place where she didn't have to perform strength or certainty or any of the other masks rulers wore to convince everyone they knew what they were doing. Iris brought tea she didn't drink and bread she didn't eat. The old woman sat across from her in companionable silence, understanding that sometimes presence mattered more than words. Eventually, Celine spoke. My mother. When she died alone on that battlefield. Did she die believing it was worth it? Iris was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, but I know she died believing she had no other choice. That's not the same thing. I keep thinking about what Vivienne said, about the kingdom grinding up people, about us being predators who got lucky. She wasn't entirely wrong, but she also wasn't entirely right. Iris leaned forward. Your mother understood something Vivienne never could. Power isn't about taking. It's about stewardship, about protecting the people who can't protect themselves, about making hard choices so others don't have to. Your mother died trying to defend farmers who'd never know her name. That's not predation, that's sacrifice. But what if I'm not capable of that kind of sacrifice? What if I've spent so much energy surviving that I've forgotten how to be the kind of ruler this kingdom actually needs? Then you learn. The old woman's voice was firm. You learn by doing the work, by making mistakes and fixing them, by admitting when you're wrong and adjusting course. Your mother's biggest failure wasn't that she died fighting. It was that she refused to believe anyone else could share the burden. She died alone because she'd convinced herself only she was strong enough to carry the weight. Don't make the same mistake. After Iris left, Celine sat in darkness, turning over those words like stones in her hands. The weight of what came next pressed down on her shoulders, heavier than any crown, more suffocating than any title. Vivienne would die tomorrow. Cedric would remain king in name, but powerless in practice. And Celine would have to decide what kind of ruler she wanted to be now that she'd destroyed everyone who'd tried to stop her. She pulled her father's signet ring from her pocket, the one she'd been carrying since the anniversary banquet. The phoenix crest caught lamplight, wings spread in eternal flight or eternal fall depending on how you looked at it. Power serves those who never stop moving, the inscription read. But her father had died exhausted. Her mother had died alone. And Celine was beginning to understand that maybe the inscription was wrong. Maybe power didn't serve anyone. Maybe it just consumed until there was nothing left but ash and the memory of fire. She was still sitting there when Theron knocked softly and entered without waiting for permission. The old soldier looked as tired as she felt, his face lined with exhaustion that went bone deep. Couldn't sleep? She asked. Haven't slept properly since the bombing. Don't think I will for a while. He sat without being invited. Been thinking about what happens after tomorrow, after Vivienne's executed and the immediate crisis passes. What comes next? Celine met his eyes. That's what I've been trying to figure out. The kingdom's barely holding together. Cedric's too weak to rule effectively. The nobles are split between supporting him out of tradition and supporting me because they think I'm more competent. And the people, the actual people beyond these walls, they're starving and exhausted, and one bad winter away from riots we might not be able to contain. So what do you want to do about it? The question hung in the air like smoke. What did she want? 6 months ago, the answer would have been simple. Support Cedric, manage his weaknesses, hold the kingdom together through patience and compromise. But that version of herself had died somewhere between discovering the forged treasury documents and watching the council chamber explode. I want to tear down everything that allowed someone like Vivienne to nearly destroy us, she said slowly. I want to rebuild economic systems that don't require bleeding the merchant class dry. I want military leadership based on competence instead of who pays the largest bribes. I want a kingdom where being born poor doesn't automatically mean dying poor. She paused. And I want Cedric off the throne before his incompetence kills more people. That's treason, Theron observed. Again, is it? Because from where I sit, forcing an incompetent king to abdicate in favor of someone who might actually save the kingdom sounds like the most loyal thing I could do. Celine stood, pacing to the window. I'm tired of watching this place fall apart. Tired of pretending one more compromise will fix things. Tired of being patient while people suffer. If that makes me a traitor, then I'm a traitor. but at least I'll be a traitor who gives a damn whether the kingdom survives. The military would support you. Most of it anyway. The generals who matter have already made their positions clear. And the nobles? Split. Maybe a third firmly against you, a third firmly for you, the rest waiting to see which way the wind blows. Standard political cowardice. So if I moved against Cedric, if I called for his abdication, it would tear the kingdom in half, probably. Theron was quiet for a moment. But here's the thing. It's already torn. The bombing did that. Vivienne did that. Years of neglect and corruption and incompetent leadership did that. You're not creating a crisis. You're just forcing everyone to acknowledge the one that already exists. Celine pressed her forehead against the cold glass. I don't want to be the person who destroys a dynasty, who tears down 3 centuries of tradition, who breaks oaths and betrays vows, and becomes everything people warned about when women try to claim power. Then don't be. Be the person who saves a kingdom from the dynasty that was already destroying it. Be the person who has the courage to break bad traditions and forge better ones. Be the person this realm actually needs instead of the person everyone's comfortable with. Theron stood. Your mother died defending this kingdom. Your father died grieving her loss. You have a chance they never did, to survive and build something better from what they left behind. Don't waste it trying to be someone you're not anymore. After he left, Selene stood alone watching dawn approach. The sky lightened from black to gray to the pale blue that promised a day without rain. Below, the capital was beginning to wake. Servants starting fires, bakers opening ovens, the slow machinery of daily life grinding forward regardless of palace politics. Those people didn't care about tradition or dynasty or the elaborate games nobles played. They cared about food and safety and the basic dignity of being able to survive without constant fear. And they'd been failed by every ruler who'd put political convenience ahead of their welfare. Celine had been complicit in that failure. She'd spent 15 years propping up a king who didn't deserve the throne because tradition said wives supported husbands and queens deferred to kings. She'd swallowed her own competence and judgment because acknowledging she was better suited to rule would have shattered the comfortable fiction everyone preferred. No more. If she was going to burn for treason, she'd burn for actually changing something instead of just surviving another crisis. She found Cedric in his private chambers, sitting by a window that overlooked the gardens where they'd walked together in what felt like a different lifetime. He looked up as she entered, his expression cycling through surprise, wariness, resignation. I know why you're here, he said. Do you? You're going to ask me to abdicate, to step aside and let you rule because I've proven I'm not capable. He turned back to the window. You're right, by the way. I'm not capable. Never was. I just got very good at pretending and letting you do all the actual work. Celine sat in the chair across from him. When did you realize? Honestly? Probably always knew on some level. But admitting it would have meant confronting how much I needed you, how little I actually contributed beyond showing up and wearing the crown. It was easier to resent you for being competent than to admit I was inadequate. The honesty caught her off guard. She'd expected defensiveness, anger, the usual pattern of him attacking when cornered. This vulnerability was new, possibly real, definitely unsettling. What happens now? He asked. Now you make a choice. You can abdicate voluntarily, claim health reasons, or desire to pursue other interests and retain some dignity. You'll keep your title and a comfortable income. You'll live out your life in relative peace. Or you can fight me, and I'll drag every failure and every poor decision into public view. I'll prove you were either complicit in Vivienne's treason or too incompetent to notice, and you'll be removed by force and exiled with nothing. And if I choose to fight, then you'll lose. I have the military. I have popular support. I have evidence and allies and the momentum of someone who just saved this kingdom from collapsing. You have tradition and a title and not much else. She kept her voice even, factual. This isn't a threat, Cedric. It's reality. The only question is whether you exit with grace or get dragged out screaming. He was quiet for a long time, staring out at gardens that had been planted by his grandfather. Finally, he spoke. I did love you, you know? In my own inadequate way. I just didn't love you as much as I loved the idea of myself as king. And by the time I realized the difference, it was too late to fix. Celine felt something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of letting go. I know. And I loved you too. Enough to spend 15 years sacrificing my own potential to protect yours. We were both prisoners of who we thought we should be instead of who we actually were. Do you think you'll be a good ruler? Without me to... His laugh was bitter. To take credit for your work? I don't know. But I'll be present. I'll be competent. I'll give a damn whether people outside these walls survive or starve. That's already better than what we've been doing. Cedric stood, moving to his desk. He pulled out paper and ink, writing slowly, his hand shaking slightly. When he finished, he pressed his signet ring into red wax, sealing the document. My abdication. Effective immediately. Health reasons. Desire to pursue scholarly interest. All very dignified. He handed her the paper. I have one condition. Celine waited. Don't let them remember me as the weak king who nearly destroyed everything. Let there be some mercy in how history records what I was. I may not deserve it, but... His voice cracked. I'd like to not be remembered only for my failures. She took the document, reading through formal language that handed her everything she'd been fighting for. All the power, all the responsibility, all the weight of saving a kingdom that had been crumbling for years. I'll do what I can, she said. But Cedric, history doesn't remember us the way we want. It remembers us for what we actually did. The only mercy I can offer is that I won't actively destroy your reputation. What people believe about you, that's something you'll have to live with. Fair enough. She left him there, sitting in his chambers, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. The man who'd been her husband, her king, her project for 15 years. Reduced now to just a man who'd made bad choices and lost everything because of them. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it just felt like the end of something that had been dying for years and finally stopped moving. Vivianne's execution drew a crowd that filled the public square and spilled into surrounding streets. Celine watched from a high window, unable to bring herself to attend in person. She'd already witnessed enough death, already carried enough weight of lives ended. The executioner was efficient. The blade fell. The crowd made noises, some cheering, some gasping, some just silent. And then it was over. The woman who'd nearly torn apart a kingdom was gone, reduced to a cautionary tale about ambition without ethics. Celine felt nothing, no satisfaction, no relief, just hollow exhaustion and the knowledge that killing Vivianne didn't undo the damage she'd caused, didn't bring back the dead nobles, didn't repair the broken economy, didn't heal the wounds carved into a kingdom that had been failing its people long before Vivianne arrived. That night, the nobles gathered for a hastily organized ceremony. Cedric's abdication had been announced that morning, shocking everyone who'd been preparing for civil war or extended political maneuvering. Now they assembled to witness Celine's coronation, not as queen consort but as queen regnant in her own right. The ceremony was simpler than tradition demanded. No elaborate costume changes, no performance of humility before accepting the crown. Celine stood before the assembled court, wearing dark blue silk and her father's signet ring. She met their eyes without flinching, without pretending to be anything she wasn't. The crown was heavier than it looked, cold metal that had sat on 3 generations of heads, carrying the weight of decisions and consequences and the accumulated price of power. When they placed it on her head, Celine felt the physical weight and understood viscerally what her father had meant about burdens that never lifted. The nobles knelt, not all of them. A third remained standing, declaring by their posture that they didn't accept this transfer of power. Celine had expected that, would deal with it later. For now, she just needed to survive this moment without breaking under the pressure of everything it represented. Do you swear to rule justly? The minister intoned. To protect the realm and its people? To place the kingdom's welfare above your own desires? I swear. The words felt like chains wrapping around her chest. I swear to serve this kingdom with everything I have. To make decisions that benefit the many instead of the few. To admit when I'm wrong and course correct. To be the ruler this realm needs even when it's hard. Even when it costs me personally. Even when I fail and have to get up and try again. That wasn't the traditional oath. Nobles shifted uncomfortably. But Celine didn't care about tradition anymore. She cared about truth. About setting expectations that were actually achievable instead of perpetuating comfortable fictions. The ceremony ended. Musicians played. Nobles who'd knelt approached to swear personal loyalty or calculate how to profit from this shift in power. And through it all, Celine felt the weight of the crown pressing down, reminding her with every breath that she'd just claimed responsibility for everything that came next. Later, long after the ceremony ended and the nobles dispersed, Celine stood on the balcony where she'd confronted Vivienne at the anniversary banquet. The same stars looked down, the same city spread below, but everything felt different now. She wasn't the queen trying to hold together someone else's kingdom. She was the queen who owned every decision, every consequence, every success and failure that would follow. Iris found her there, carrying wine and the particular brand of blunt honesty that came from having nothing to lose. "You did it." The old woman handed her a glass. "You're queen, everything you fought for, everything you sacrificed for. How does it feel?" "Terrifying." Celine took the wine but didn't drink. Like I just volunteered to carry a mountain on my shoulders, and everyone's watching to see if I collapse. Welcome to ruling. It never stops feeling like that. Iris leaned against the railing. "Your mother told me once that the crown was the loneliest burden anyone could carry. That the moment they placed it on her head, she understood she'd never again have the luxury of uncertainty or the comfort of sharing blame." Was she right? About the loneliness? Absolutely. About it being worth it anyway? That depends on whether you measure worth in personal happiness or in the lives you protect. She drank deeply. "Your mother died unhappy, but thousands of people are alive because of decisions she made. Is that worth being lonely?" "I don't know, but it's something." Celine finally sipped the wine. It was bitter. Everything was bitter lately. I keep thinking about what Vivienne said at the trial. About the kingdom grinding up people. About us being predators who got lucky. She was hurt and lashing out. Don't mistake pain for wisdom. But what if she was right? What if all I've done is replace one flawed ruler with another? What if I'm just better at hiding my inadequacies? Then you'll fail and someone else will take your place and maybe they'll do better. That's how this works. Iris turned to face her. "You're not supposed to be perfect, girl. You're supposed to be present. To give a damn, to try your best and keep trying when you fail. That's all anyone can do, even queens." They stood in silence, watching the city settle into night. Below, in houses and shops and narrow streets, people were living lives that had nothing to do with crowns or palaces or the elaborate performance of royal power. They were just surviving, just trying to get through another day without disaster. Those were the people Celine had claimed responsibility for, not the nobles who'd knelt or the ministers who'd calculate how to manipulate her. The ordinary people who'd never know her name but whose lives would be shaped by every decision she made. The weight of that understanding settled like iron in her bones. In the weeks that followed, Celine began the slow work of rebuilding. She released emergency grain reserves, preventing the famine that had been approaching. She restructured the merchant tariffs, bringing them back to levels that allowed businesses to survive. She dismissed corrupt ministers and appointed competent ones regardless of their noble lineage. She met with generals and rewrote military protocols to emphasize merit over bribes. Every decision created enemies. Every reform threatened someone's profit margin. Every change sparked resistance from people who'd benefited from the old broken system. But slowly, painfully slowly, things began to shift. Food prices stabilized. Merchants stopped hemorrhaging money. The riots that had been suppressed for months gradually ceased because people weren't quite so desperate anymore. The kingdom didn't heal overnight. Wounds carved that deep took years to close, but at least the bleeding slowed. 3 months after her coronation, Celine stood in the same public square where Vivienne had been executed. But this time she wasn't there to witness death. She was there to announce the first series of reforms aimed at helping people who'd been abandoned by previous rulers. A crowd gathered, larger than she'd expected, more diverse. Not just nobles performing duty, but actual citizens who'd heard rumors and come to see if the new queen was different from what they'd learned to expect. Celine stood on a platform without guards surrounding her, making herself vulnerable in a way that terrified her security but felt necessary. She looked out at faces weathered by work, eyes tired from generations of being ignored, and spoke from a place that bypassed her prepared speech entirely. "I won't stand here and promise you perfection. I won't claim to have all the answers or pretend the problems facing this kingdom can be fixed quickly. What I will promise is this: I see you. I understand that policy failures in this palace mean hunger in your homes. I know that when we make mistakes here, you pay the price. And I'm committing right now, in front of all of you, that every decision I make will start by asking what serves the people who have no voice in these halls. The crowd was silent, not the polite silence of noble gatherings, but the stunned quiet of people hearing something they'd stopped expecting. "You don't owe me loyalty just because I wear a crown," she continued. "Loyalty has to be earned, trust has to be built, and I'm starting from negative ground because everyone who wore this crown before me failed you in ways large and small. So I'm asking for one thing: time. Time to prove through actions that I mean what I'm saying. Time to demonstrate that power can be used to protect instead of exploit. Time to show you that not everyone born into privilege forgets what it means to serve." She laid out the reforms. Food subsidies for families below a certain income. Restructured merchant taxes that would lower prices without destroying businesses. Infrastructure projects that would create jobs. Educational programs so that being born poor didn't automatically mean dying illiterate. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was a beginning. When she finished, the crowd didn't cheer. They just watched, assessing, calculating whether to believe or whether this was just another empty promise from another ruler who'd forget them the moment it became inconvenient. Celine understood that skepticism, welcomed it even. They should demand proof, should hold her accountable, should refuse to accept pretty words without corresponding actions. That was what real power looked like, not the ability to command, but the willingness to be held responsible. 6 months into her reign, Celine received word that Cedric had died quietly in his sleep. The physician said his heart simply stopped, a combination of lingering injuries from the bombing and the particular exhaustion that came from giving up on living. She attended his funeral, standing in the back while nobles delivered eulogies that carefully navigated between honoring tradition and acknowledging reality. They called him a man of his time, a ruler who'd faced unprecedented challenges, a king who'd ultimately prioritized the kingdom by stepping aside. All of it was code for he was inadequate, but let's not speak ill of the dead. Celine felt no satisfaction, no vindication, just the hollow sadness that came from watching someone who'd once meant everything to her reduced to diplomatic half-truths and carefully worded praise. After the ceremony, she visited his grave alone. The headstone was simple, lacking the elaborate ornamentation usually afforded to kings. That had been her decision, one final mercy. Let him rest without the weight of a crown he'd never been suited to carry. "I don't know if you can hear me," she said quietly. "I don't know if it matters, but I want you to know I'm trying to be the ruler we both should have been, trying to fix the things we broke, trying to build something better from the ruins we left." The wind moved through trees that didn't care about kings or queens or the elaborate human drama of power and failure. Celine stood there until the sun began to set, saying goodbye to a man she'd loved and hated and finally just felt tired about. Then she returned to the palace and the endless work of ruling. A year after her coronation, Celine stood in her father's study, her study now, reviewing reports that showed incremental progress. The economy was stabilizing. Food security had improved. The riots had stopped because people weren't quite so desperate anymore. It wasn't prosperity, it wasn't utopia, but it was better than it had been. Theron knocked and entered, his weathered face showing approval. The new trade agreements with the eastern provinces just got ratified. That should open up markets we haven't had access to in years. Good. What else? The university reform bill passed. Starting next year, admission will be based on merit instead of lineage. We're expecting significant resistance from noble families who've been buying their children's positions. Let them resist. Celine set down the report. Competence matters more than bloodline. They'll adjust or their children will be left behind. Theron smiled. "You sound like your mother. Is that a compliment or a warning?" "Both." He moved to the window, looking out at gardens that had been replanted after the bombing damage. "She'd want you to know she'd be proud of what you've built, how you've grown into this." Celine joined him at the window. "Some days I'm not sure I've grown into anything except exhaustion and cynicism. That's just wisdom wearing a pessimistic mask. You're doing what needs to be done. You're making hard choices. You're prioritizing people over politics. That's rare. That matters." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the kingdom continue its slow process of healing. That evening, Celine did something she hadn't done in over a year. She walked through the city without guards, wearing plain clothes, just another person in the crowd. She wanted to see how people lived when they didn't know a queen was watching. wanted to understand what was working and what was still broken. She passed through markets where vendors called out prices that were lower than they'd been in years, walked by schools where children from working families sat alongside noble offspring, all learning the same lessons, stood outside taverns where people argued politics without fear of arrest for criticizing the crown. It wasn't perfect. She saw poverty that reforms hadn't touched, saw suffering that would take generations to address, saw the deep scars left by decades of neglect that couldn't be healed by good intentions and restructured policies. But she also saw something she hadn't seen in years. Hope. Not the naive kind that believed one good ruler would fix everything. The exhausted, stubborn kind that came from people who'd been knocked down repeatedly and decided to get up one more time. That was enough. That had to be enough. She returned to the palace as the city settled into night, feeling the weight of the crown even though she wasn't wearing it. Understanding finally what her father had tried to teach her, that ruling wasn't about power or control or even competence. It was about showing up every day and trying to do slightly better than you'd done yesterday. About making mistakes and course correcting. About accepting that you'd never get everything right but refusing to let that stop you from trying. 2 years after her coronation, Celine stood on the same balcony where she'd removed her wedding ring and decided to fight back. The anniversary of that night felt like looking back at a different person, someone younger, angrier, more certain that destroying what was broken would automatically create something better. She knew now that destruction was easy. Creation was the hard part. Iris found her there, moving more slowly now, but still sharp as ever. Thinking about how far you've come? Thinking about how far there is left to go. The kingdom's more stable, but still fragile. The reforms are working, but need constant adjustment. I've made enemies who'll spend the rest of their lives trying to undermine everything I've built. So you're exactly where your mother was, fighting battles that never end, wondering if anything you do actually matters. Does it matter, Iris smiled. Ask the children who can now attend school regardless of their parents' wealth. Ask the merchants who aren't bankrupt anymore. Ask the farmers who have access to emergency grain supplies when harvests fail. They'll tell you whether it matters. Celine absorbed this. Below, the capital sprawled in layers of light and shadow. A city that had nearly torn itself apart. A kingdom that had teetered on the edge of collapse. All of it still standing because someone had decided to care when it would have been easier to walk away. Your mother died believing she'd failed, Iris continued. Died thinking she hadn't done enough. But she'd saved thousands of lives through decisions nobody ever thanked her for. She'd prevented disasters that never happened because she'd stopped them before they started. That was her legacy. Not perfection, just the stubborn refusal to stop trying. And mine? Too early to tell. But you're building something. It's messy and imperfect and will probably need significant repairs before you're done. But it's yours. It's real. And it's helping people who'd been abandoned for generations. That's not nothing. After the old woman left, Celine stayed on the balcony, watching night deepen over a kingdom she'd fought to save and now had to nurture into something worth saving. She thought about the woman she'd been, the queen who'd spent 15 years suppressing herself to support a man who'd never deserved it, the wife who'd believed loyalty and patience would be enough, the person who'd thought power was something you supported from behind instead of claimed for yourself. That woman was gone, dead as surely as if she'd died in the council chamber bombing. In her place stood someone harder, scarred, exhausted down to her bones from carrying weight that never lightened, but also someone who'd learned that strength wasn't about never breaking. It was about breaking and then having the courage to rebuild yourself into something functional, even if you'd never be whole again. She pulled her father's signet ring from her pocket, the phoenix rising from ash. She'd carried it through everything, through betrayal and bombing, and the slow, painful work of becoming someone capable of bearing the weight of a crown. Power serves those who never stop moving, the inscription read. But Celine had learned a deeper truth. Power didn't serve anyone. It just existed, waiting to be claimed by people brave enough or foolish enough or desperate enough to reach for it. And once you claimed it, once you put that crown on your head and swore those oaths, you couldn't put it down without abandoning everyone who'd trusted you to carry it. That was the real price. Not the loneliness or the exhaustion or the constant weight of impossible decisions. The price was knowing you couldn't quit, couldn't walk away, couldn't surrender the burden even when it crushed you because too many people depended on you bearing it. Her mother had understood that, had carried it until it killed her. And now Celine understood it too. She slipped the ring onto her finger beside the crown's matching band. Two pieces of metal that weighed almost nothing and felt like the entire kingdom pressing down on her hand. Dawn was approaching. Another day, another 100 decisions, another opportunity to fail or succeed in small incremental ways that would compound over years into either salvation or ruin. Celine straightened her shoulders, feeling every year of exhaustion and growth and transformation that had brought her to this moment. She'd stopped being the woman who'd removed her wedding ring at that banquet. Stopped being the wife who'd believed patience was enough. Stopped being the queen who'd let others define what she was allowed to become. Now she was just herself. Flawed and exhausted and still learning, still making mistakes, still fighting battles that would never end. But present, competent. Committed to the slow, unglamorous work of turning a broken kingdom into something that might, with years of effort, actually serve the people it was supposed to protect. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined when this all started. There was no triumphant victory, no moment of pure satisfaction, no clean resolution where everything was fixed and she could finally rest. Just the quiet understanding that she'd survived, that she'd changed, that she'd become someone capable of bearing witness to her own transformation without flinching from what it had cost. Below, the city began to wake. Bakers lighting ovens, merchants opening shops, the slow machinery of daily life grinding forward because people got up and tried again even when everything was hard. Celine watched them, these citizens who'd never know her name but whose lives she'd sworn to protect. And for the first time since she'd put on her father's ring and decided to fight back, she felt something other than rage or exhaustion or grim determination. She felt purpose. Real purpose. The kind that came from knowing your work mattered, even if nobody ever thanked you for it. Even if you died exhausted and uncertain. Even if the kingdom you'd saved took generations to heal. She'd lost a husband she'd never really had. Lost the comfortable fiction of a marriage that had been failing long before she'd admitted it. Lost the woman she'd been and could never return to being. But she'd gained something too. Something harder to name but easier to feel. The knowledge that she was enough. That she'd always been enough. That the crown belonged on her head not because of bloodline or tradition, but because she'd earned it through blood and sacrifice and the stubborn refusal to die quietly when they tried to bury her. The sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. A new day. Another chance. Another opportunity to be slightly better than she'd been yesterday. Celine turned from the balcony and walked back into the palace, carrying the weight of a crown and a kingdom, and the knowledge that some battles never ended. They just became the life you chose to live. And she'd chosen this. Chosen to fight. Chosen to survive. Chosen to transform loss into purpose and pain into power. The woman who'd removed her wedding ring and declared war on everyone who'd betrayed her was gone. In her place stood a queen who'd learned that the real victory wasn't in destroying your enemies. It was in refusing to become one.